I don't know, you'll probably be about as good as I was. That's kind of the way it works, and I was below average, so you'll probably ultimately rank somewhere around there, I don't want you out here shooting this ball around all day and night, all right?
All right.
Okay? All right, go ahead. Hey. Period.
That's Will Smith from The Pursuit of Happiness. Boy, I love that movie. And as far as how it fits, how it connects with today's very long, but I think insightful in so many ways, interview with Dr. Jeffery Martin, well, I think that's kind of an Easter egg. We're all going to have to kind of find that and figure out if there is that connection or not. But at least I think there is. So see what you think. All right, here's a clip from the interview. And I picked one from, this is such a long interview, I picked one from almost the end. So maybe you get an idea that there's a reason to stick around to the end.
And so Dean and I were talking about he was doing like chocolate intention experiments or something at that time. And he like gave me this piece of chocolate that was infused with the intention of love or something. And, he gives me the chocolate and asks me if I feel any different and, stuff like that. And I love chocolate. So I was just grateful for the chocolate. I was hungry by that point. Ions took a while to get to. It was longer than I thought it would take to drive out there. Yeah. And I was like, well, before she leaves, let's look at her data, And so we go into the other room and it's got like these bar graphs sort of on the screen. So it's walking her through the trial. And he's like, what did you do on this one? Do you remember what you did on this one? Did you remember what you did on this one? So on and so forth. And all of them were like, I don't know, kind of middle of the road bars. And then there was this one bar that was like kind of off the charts. And he gets to that one. And he's like, do you remember what you did at this one? And she just sort of looked at him. And then she sort of looked over at me and the other person from our lab that was visiting with me. And you could tell that she didn't want to say, And so she tried to give like some sort of half-ass sort of response to it. And I'm like, well, I'm not gonna, settle for that. Like, you were really precise on the other ones. Like, what did you do on this one? And so she thinks that she pauses for a while and she looks at us some more and she thinks about it. And she says, well, there's this thing I can do where I can kind of make myself go away. She describes like basically being able to put herself into this temporary non-symbolic experience. And she's like, that's what I was doing when I did that bar. I thought, well, that's very interesting.
Welcome to Skeptiko, where we explore controversial science and spirituality with leading researchers, thinkers, and their critics. I'm your host, Alex Sakaris, and today we welcome back Dr. Jeffery Martin to Skeptiko. In case you don't remember, Dr. Martin is a Harvard-trained social scientist, author of the book, The Finders, which, as we mentioned in the previous interview, has been widely praised by tons of very prominent, well-respected names in psychology, neuroscience, and just, I don't know, thinking people in general. Jeffery and his team are also the creators of the Finders course, which is rather intensive 16-week, although we're going to have to talk about that because there's kind of a new course coming out. Meditation and mind training course, although that's kind of pigeonholing it maybe in a way that we wouldn't have to. But it's a course that claims to do nothing less than permanently shift your sense of well-being. Probably about the biggest thing you could do in your life. And as we explored in the last interview, the thing about Jeffery is from the beginning, he's been all about the science, all about the numbers. And by the best standards we have, the gold standard type standards within psychology and the social sciences, it's hard to argue that he hasn't really cracked the code here. So it's an interesting body of work, fascinating, and we chatted a little bit before the interview, and I'm going to plug that in at some point. But let me just start with welcome you back, Dr. Martin. Thanks for coming back on Skeptiko.
Thanks, Alec. It's great to be here.
So in the last interview, we talked about a lot of stuff, and I think there's a lot to kind of pick up on just from where we left off, because there's a lot of things going on in your world and in the world in general that I think are relevant to this idea of self-development, meditation training, mind training, but let's start with just some of the basics. I maybe did a very brief sketch of who you are. Remind people about who is Jeffery Martin, and in particular, how you came about doing this, developing this course and the book that you wrote.
You know, I'm someone who was in media and advertising and technology and built businesses in those types of spaces for many years. I had a lot of success. And at the end of all of that, which was in my mid-30s, I was not that happy. I was not unhappy, but it was just obvious to me that there were people that were a lot happier than I was. And, you know, being a type A overachiever person at that point in my life, I basically just quit everything that I was doing and went back to school and tried to figure out how I could have the happiness and fulfillment that as a type A person, I felt I so rightly deserved.
Well, and if I can, let me add another part to this story, because it's not hidden. You shared it in an interview before, but it's a very personal part that I think anyone without being armchair psychologist would have to see factors into that. And that's that during your upbringing, you were exposed to some rather, intense religious kind of experiences, televangelist experiences, and you kind of saw some of the dark side of spiritual salesmanship. But at the same time, I'm sure you were exposed to the potential of this well-being change, this awareness, awakening kind of thing, whether it comes through the televangelist on the screen or whether it comes through meditation. So how did that had to be a factor just through your upbringing? Do you think you were a seeker all along, or a tainted seeker, maybe a skeptical seeker, if you will?
I was, well, at one point an enthusiastic seeker, at another point a skeptical seeker, a disillusioned seeker. I think I went through all the phases that so many people do. I think everyone is a seeker. That's, in hindsight, that's what makes advertising work, right? Is that everybody's out there looking for something. We all feel that sense of fundamental discontentment. We've all got goals. If you don't think you feel some sort of discontentment, then ask yourself, is there something you want? And then ask yourself, why is it that you want that, right? It's because there's some sort of discontentment. There's a reason why we can make a Ford truck, and map that over into what's going to, in your own imagination, make you believe that it's going to dramatically change everything for your life if you could just get the 2020 Ford truck or whatever, right?
Let's talk about that for a minute, because this is like really basics, but it's easy to kind of slip past this. And I think it's so embedded in what you do that it deserves kind of pulling apart. And that's that it's almost like you're talking to two different audiences. You're talking to one audience, which is just the first life kind of people. And I have to kind of disagree with you there. I know, and I think most people who feel that they're a spiritual seeker or on spiritual path, one of the things that they'll tell you is it's frustrating that they encounter so many people who know that Ford truck, they are convinced that is all that they need. And when they get the Ford truck and they experience, which we all experience, which is for the first week, it's extremely exciting, man. And you show all your friends and you drive, and then about 3 weeks, you're like, man, I start feeling like a lot of like my last truck. But where that leaves most people is they just substitute it for the next thing that they want, the next distraction. Mm-hmm. And then so that's one group of people. And I think people who are seekers, they go, man, wake up. I mean, at least feel the angst that I feel in realizing that I'm on this wheel. And then it seems like you're talking to this other group of people who are like, man, he's right. When Jeffery says fundamental discontentment, it just, boom, it hits me in my stomach. It's like, God, no matter what I do, I still have this fundamental discontentment. I gotta somehow find a way beyond that. And that's why I think your course in your book is really talking to. Do you want to speak to that? Because I think, what I mean.
That's exactly right. I think it's challenging to figure out how to reach people who are stuck so deeply in culture, which frankly, I had a role in creating for many years early in my life, getting people on that treadmill, keeping people on that treadmill, keeping them distracted, getting them to think, listen, it's your relationship, it's that you need this education, it's that you need this next house or car, or if you only had this watch, or, whatever else. And culture is so effective at, basically keeping people distracted by that they don't have a chance to oftentimes ask the deeper questions. And so absolutely, that's been a big challenge and a big, I'd say, frustration since I've been in this line of work. The advertising line of work turned out to be incredibly easy, compared to this line of work, because it had all of culture behind it and going for it, right? And this is going completely against all of that. It's interesting. Although it's funny, I was at this event called Stream Asia many years ago now, maybe in 2010 or something. And Stream Asia was the guy who built one of the world's largest advertising conglomerates, WPP, named Marty Sorrell, and Sir Martin Sorrell. And he had this thing where he would basically take people, 100 people once or twice a year to some exotic location and basically put them in a pot and stir, right? And so I went there and I was in the middle of this research, got invited, more because of what I was doing before, obviously, than this particular research, right? But as somebody who went, everybody more or less had to give some presentation, right? And so I gave a presentation on what I was working on, which was sort of the opposite of what everybody else was working on at this event, right? And you had, it's like that. This one was in Thailand, and so it had like all of the people who ran the Googles of China and the Facebooks of China and all of that, in addition to all the ad people and all that. And afterward, Marty came up with like his main lieutenant, which was an R&D guy, the main R&D guy and stuff, and he was like a little concerned about, what I might be onto or up to and how it would affect the global advertising industry if there was ever a success. And then later I had a meal with a guy who was like the top economist at like the IMF or the World Bank or something like that. I can't remember. It's been so many years ago now. And that guy was like, a 3% drop in global consumption and pretty much it's all over. Like, what are you working on here, buddy?
Yeah, right.
And so there's like this massive pushback, not just at a grassroots cultural level, but like if you're at the top level of the system and you kind of understand how it all works and whatever else, this is a little freaky to you too. I told Marty, listen, the people that I know, they still buy new cell phones.
That's a great story. That is, I don't want to go there too far because we could fall into that and kind of never get out. But
right,
it's almost too hard to resist because the intersection between culture shaping and business is so much more than I think people realize. And it does come into play with regard to these things that we're talking about. And it may even explain why, as we were chatting about before we kind of hit the record button, actually I had already hit the record button, but we're chatting about is, it's almost like you are now put in a position of marketing against those guys. And I guess that's what you're saying. And that's a tough road to hoe. And I almost wonder,
it is.
I said this kind of at the beginning of the interview, and I every time I talk to you, Jeffrey, I halfway expect you to be a lot further down this path, not in terms of the work that you've done or the course, which is fantastic, but in terms of its acceptance of it. And kind of when you say that, the light bulb goes off and it's like, man, you have a tough road to hoe because people are being told, no matter how good it is, you don't want to go there. You don't want to give up on your iPhone, your new app, or whatever you think you're going to have to give up on.
Mm-hmm. And that's, of course, not true. They don't give up on it. And it's even made worse by a lot of the people that are in the traditional marketplace around this stuff, right? And so one of the things that we did not long ago is I did this survey of serious seekers, because I started to just wonder more about, like, you know, what's preventing even the people who say they really want to get to the type of stuff that we research. What's preventing them from? Now we know from our research that it's not that hard to get to, right? I mean, you know, we just ran this new experiment, which was a 6-week experiment that transitioned like 65% of people that took it in 6 weeks, right? So this idea that this is like in some way going to suck decades of your life or whatever else away. It's what is it that I was thinking to myself, what is it that's really preventing at this point someone who's a serious seeker from reaching this? And it was a fascinating answer. I didn't realize how pervasive it was, but for the people who are really immersed in this, like they're watching all the videos and they're reading the books and, you know, they're just like, this is the thing. They're terrified of having success with this. And the reason is because of the way the people that are in that marketplace talk about it. You know, they're constantly saying things like, you go away, and, you know, there is no me, and things like that. And it turns out that even for seekers who have absorbed a ton of that material, that's kind of a horrifying thing to hear. So imagine how horrifying it is for the average person.
Break that down a little bit, just so we make sure that people understand what we're talking about when we say words like transition and the other people in that community and stuff like that. So again, back to the basics, you know, there's the guy who's, and not the guy, because when you put Ford truck, it's like we're putting down some, you know, bumpkin out in the country. Man, I live in Southern California, and it's, you know, it's the Porsche, it's the Mercedes, it's whatever you want to put in there. It's just one thing substituted after another. And as you said, I think quite honestly and quite correctly, you were fine-tuning your skills to replace one artificial materialistic need after another as part of your marketing profession. So you're over in this thing and you say, okay, I really want to get at this fundamental sense of discontentment that people feel as soon as they wake up even a little bit, and they say, wow, no, that's really doing it for me. And one of the things we should remind people of, that your methodology, which I think is just super duper from an entrepreneur standpoint, I just always thought was brilliant. You went around the country, went around the world, and went to the best teachers you could find who claimed that they knew something about enlightenment, about well-being improvement. And you said, okay, show me what you know. And you did these intensive, deep, 12-hour interviews with these people. And then because you're top-notch social scientist and you went to Harvard and you are really smart, you just compiled all that down and said, I'm going to take the best of the best. It's like a guy who wants to open up a pizza restaurant and goes to the best pizza restaurants and goes in the back and sees the pizza maker and says, okay, show me how you do it. And then goes back and says, well, I ought to be good. I just sat down with 100 of the best pizza makers. So that is really the origins of this course. And then I think that puts some context into what you're talking about in terms of, the pushback from people that are kind of in this space. And we should fill in the gap there. I mean, you're talking about like, if you go, a guy who has a Buddhist group, and Buddhists kind of go all over the place, especially in the West, but, has his little Buddhist training and that, or, whether it's, I'm sure it's also new Christian movements as well, they're all out there. If you think about it, in a way, they're a competitor saying that we can increase your sense of well-being if you come to believe what we believe. So did I accurately kind of put some of those pieces in place in terms of where you fit in terms of coming along and saying, well, maybe you ought to try this, because at least I've tried my best to quantify the effectiveness of this, and the other ones you're following haven't really done that.
Yeah, we're the first ones to apply science to it, basically. That's the only thing that's different about us. And many people tried to apply science to it in the past. I feel like we just came along at the right time with the internet and global travel, and it was like the moment where you could do what we did. And so I think that's exactly right. But in the real hardcore of this, there is this notion that people talk about that sounds terrifying to the average person, and it turns out it's even scary to the seeker, of this: you go away. There is no me. It's almost like it's this badge of honor or this benchmark sort of notion among all of these folks. And the average person, spends their entire life building up them. It's like the one thing that everybody is, no matter who you are, right? You're engaged from a young age, probably around age 3 or something, when episodic memory kicks in. From that point on, in, building you. And so this notion that this thing that you've spent your entire life building up is going to go away is horrifying, because that's your entire interface to the world. It's what makes you effective at work. It's what makes your marriage work. It's what makes you a good parent. It just sounds so terrifying, and it's so incorrect.
Let's talk about that. How incorrect is it? And because I also want to mention that if we really get to the core of it, that is also the pitch from the church down on the corner, is that you will be born again, that you will somehow lose the former you. So this is a constant theme. And isn't there a kernel of truth in it as well? And that, we all talked about that shift from the, I want the Ford truck, to there's something more, is a certain dying of that self. Isn't there some reality to that as well?
Yeah, and churches are a little tricky these days because, it's hard to hear this kind of a message in a megachurch, which has become, more of the dominant type of church. The other smaller churches that talk about this stuff kind of dying out, in America, certainly. And so Christianity is a little bit of an exception. I feel like they got better at talking about this. They had Jesus, invite Jesus into your heart. The transformation was just kind of talked about in, I think, different and I would say much friendlier. One could even say much more practical kind of ways, probably. And you think about Joel Osteen's prosperity gospel and, things like that, where, Jesus and God want you to have a great life. They don't want you to live in lack.
Kind of giving them a pass there, Jeffrey, a little bit. I mean, because they're using that to slip in a lot of other stuff where you're explicitly trying to not do that. You're explicitly trying to strip it down away from that. So I just want to make sure we make that distinction. I just mean
around the sense of self type stuff. I feel like Christianity in some sense is a little different in terms of what they say than like Buddhism or Hinduism or
the whole non-dual crowd. But how about back to that
crowd?
How about back to that point though? What do you think in terms of this transformation? Is ultimately there is an element of letting go of yourself, letting go of the self that you've built up. So, you're kind of saying, hey, don't worry, you can still have your iPhone and you don't have to divorce your wife or your husband or whatever. But there isn't a sense of reintegration when you redefine who you are.
That's it. Yeah, that's such a great thread for us to pull on. I don't know that we've pulled on it before in previous interviews. And it's such an important part of our work right now, because there is definitely with many forms of this experience, what feels like the reason people talk about you go away, right, is because there's an element of it that feels like that internally, for sure, right? But what they don't often then go on to say is, but I still love golf. And I still, right, like shrimp is still my favorite meal, and it's like okay, well, where does all of that come from? Where does shrimp is my favorite meal? Where does I still wear polo shirts instead of running around the woods naked? Where does all of that come from? If it wasn't that sense of self thing that you're talking about went away, because I haven't forgotten how to do math. Those are all things that when people think about, I'm building up me and who I am in the world, I think when you say you go away, they think, wow, my ability to do math will go away, right? My ability to dress and feed myself will go. Like, these are all things that are part of the story of who we are and how we show up in the world and what makes it so terrifying. And obviously none of those things, go away unless there's some head trauma or something that's associated with the person's transition to fundamental well-being or whatever, right? And so realistically, there is a sense, no doubt, that it's what people are trying to convey. Something fundamentally changes in your sense of self. That old sort of neurotic cluster of, I think of it as habit patterns and conditioning patterns and stuff like that, that's been built up probably since about age 2.5, 3, when episodic memory kicks in. There's a profound rewiring that goes on in the brain that starts to, bypass a lot of that stuff. And how it feels in some forms of this experience is like there was an identity there that had been built up for a long time that has gone away. But I think you have to be so careful about how you talk about that, because it doesn't leave you non-functional in the world. Now, it can leave you non-functional in the world, right? You can have such a powerful, it's a very, very small minority of people that have such a powerful transition to this that they do lose functionality for a period of years, even while their brain is rewiring. You think about the famous spiritual teacher Eckhart Tolle talks about how he would sit on a park bench for a couple of years outside the library or whatever. And, just sort of trying to let a system reboot or regrok or whatever else. So yeah, you can have that kind of powerful experience. I think the downside for most people is that it's people who had those types of experiences who have tended in the West to be more likely to become the teachers, to write the books, to whatever else. And so it leaves people with this sense of like, oh, well, what happens after you transition is you wind up sitting on a park bench for a couple of years, trying to sort of regrok your life. And, and in reality, that's what happens to a tiny, we've never had a single person in our experiments, like, I don't know, 1,500, 2,000 people, something like that in our experiments at this point of inducing this, of transitioning people to this. We've never had a single person have the park bench experience, right? It's an incredibly rare experience to have. The average person just goes on with their life. They don't stop to become a spiritual teacher. They go back to work.
Hold on, because there's kind of two parts of this. One is, I can understand the importance of what you're saying, is that, you offer this course, people go through this course, your experience is that it's safe, and people come out the other side and they're able to reintegrate it in their life. And in general, they feel really great. I
would say, though, not just with the course, we had 1,200 plus research subjects before the course, even among that population, this is an extremely rare. When we started getting to people that were just, working at a meatpacking plant in Oklahoma instead of, writing books and making YouTube videos about this and whatever else, you don't hear, I had to go sit on a park bench for 2 years, right? I mean, the average person.
But when Tolle talks about being on the park bench, he talks about as being some of the best moments of his life, right? That is Eckhart Tolle's account, is that he was in complete bliss on that park bench. So we kind of got to be careful how we talk about this stuff. I totally accept what you're saying, and I think it's important to get it out there. But I think that this larger question about what's really going on, because the other thing that I hear you saying that, I don't want to kind of jump all over words and lead us down a rabbit hole, but this rewiring of the brain, we don't totally understand that is what's happening. And even the neurological models that we would apply to it and pop somebody into an fMRI and see what's happening in their brain, we don't really understand what the relationship would be between what we'd be measuring there and consciousness as it's somehow emerging or interacting between the brain and this consciousness field. And I'm going to get into a whole bunch of terms that we're not even going to visit. But I would say that this integration problem, it pops up all over the place. Like in some of the other, like you go to near-death experience stuff, which I've researched a ton.
That's interesting.
And what you'll hear is no one talks about it. And then somebody like Dr. PMH Atwater, this woman who's kind of a little bit likes to be out there on the edge, she goes, no, man, this is a major issue. Look at incidents of depression, incidents of divorce, incidents of all these things. People would never change their near-death experience, but they have a tremendous problem reintegrating that
That's interesting.
transformation into the life in a lot of the same ways that you're talking about. It would even seem to suggest, without, this is kind of a leap, but I don't think it is too much of one, is that you're offering people a safer path towards that integration, a gradual path of reintegration, versus if you have that near-death experience and you're not the one driving it, you're just, boom, you're set back in the middle of a new life and you have to pick up the pieces. So I don't know if we can make those connections, but...
So in some sense, maybe like a near-death experience is sort of more like having one of these more extreme transitions, is what you're saying, which is, that's really interesting information.
That's what they report.
Oh, that's fascinating. I think most people just transition to this and they go on with their life. So one of the things that we've been working with lately has been, since you bring up the word integration, I actually think integration is incredibly important. And that's a big focus of our work. It's been a big focus of our work for several years now, mostly because when we started transitioning people years ago, it just became something that we had to sort of help them on the other side of it, if you will, to sort of recontextualize their experience. And it was just, I didn't see it coming at the time.
This might be a good point to kind of, again, take a step back and tell people what this process is like. So you're interested now in this course that you're offering. They sign up for the course. They pay their money, whatever it is now, whatever it'll be in the future. And I want you to tell those numbers because you're not trying to hide any numbers or anything like that. And then they get a group that they're kind of assigned to, their cohort, which is a part of this process. It's part of the secret sauce, is that you have if you form a community of people who are going to go through this process together, it's going to help you make this transition. And then you go through and you practice and you have to work at this stuff pretty hard. And I want you to speak to all that. And then you're saying at the end of that, a good percentage of people feel a positive change in their life. But then you're saying they did face this issue of, wow, I've really redefined my life. I'm not sure I can deal with that on kind of more of a day-to-day psychology today kind of thing.
Right. I mean, where are my neuroses? Why don't I want the truck anymore? Why aren't I willing to sacrifice 20-hour work days to get the truck? One of the things that can happen with the transition to this is, and that has been encouraged, I think, for a really long time, is, so we use the term in the public these days, fundamental well-being. Our academic term is persistent non-symbolic experience or ongoing non-symbolic experience. But that's kind of a mouthful for the average person. And so when we wrote the book, I had to kind of think of a term that I thought expressed it well, that we could use in the public. And so fundamental well-being is sort of the bucket term for all of these different things that we studied. And there are hundreds and hundreds of terms. Non-duality, enlightenment, persistent mystical experience, shamanic ecstasy, you name it. We just cataloged a ton of terms all around the world that people use for this. So that's our one bucket term. So when you hear me use the word fundamental well-being, basically that's what I'm referring to. So from a fundamental well-being standpoint, for the most part, it has been fundamental well-being for fundamental well-being's sake that has been advocated. Right. And so when you transition to fundamental well-being, your goal is to sit on that park bench in bliss. Right. One of the things that when you hear Eckhart talking about that and how it was one of the greatest times of his life or whatever, sitting, just sinking into fundamental well-being can absolutely be phenomenal. And if you've got enough money and your life situation that affords you, if you're like him and you're not married and don't have kids, and you've got some savings, that you can live on to rent a room in a flat and go back and sleep in at night or whatever else, then that's certainly a valid life choice that someone can make. You could sit on that park bench for the next 40 years if you've got enough savings to do it. And if that's the way that you want your life to unfold from that point, that's fine. And a lot of this has been sort of what's advocated. The Hindus came up with a great way of dealing with this, where they basically said, don't even think about transitioning to fundamental well-being until you were retired. There's a stage in your life where you're growing up. There's a stage where you're going to school. There's a stage where you're working and where you're raising your family. And when you're done with all of that, fine, then transition to this. And you can sit on your porch, sink into bliss for the rest of your life. If you've done a good job with the other things, with the other elements in your life up to that point, and you do get to a place where you can retire and all of that, right? And so that's totally fine. And I don't want to disparage that as a legitimate life choice and life path or whatever in any way, because I think that's perfectly valid. But for the vast majority of people, that's really not an option. They're not living in a life circumstance where this traditional notion where it's all about fundamental well-being for fundamental well-being's sake is something that is even possible for them, unless they want to go sleep under a bridge for the rest of their life, or something like that, right? Abandon raising their kids. There's so many potential consequences in the average person's life. So does it mean that you should just wait until retirement, for this? We're going to solve it the way it was solved, in one region of the world? Well, that's one way that sort of one culture came, to grips with this. But I think, in the same sense that science can sort of wrap its arms around this, and tease out shorter, more reliable, safer, whatever sort of paths to get to this, I think science can also wrap its way around this as an integration problem and say, over here on this side of the fence, if we have fundamental well-being for fundamental well-being's sake, and over here on this side of the fence, if we have, traditional culture, which is narrative self-based, which is not going to yield at all to the fundamental well-being side of the fence. There isn't the narrative self side of the world, the egoic side of the world, our traditional culture. It's not going to be like tomorrow. It's not going to wake up and be like, oh my God, fundamental well-being people, you have completely figured it out. Let's just change everything about culture and society to adapt to you, right? The fundamental well-being people have to adapt themselves to the culture, and you have to sort of work your way to this integration. And so a lot of our work these days is around how, in a modern context, do you optimize fundamental well-being for living a modern life? And it's strangely something that just hasn't been worked on much. And part of it is just because of that intellectual and belief inheritance around, listen, once you get to this, man, it's fundamental well-being for fundamental well-being's sake. It's like you put your butt down on that park bench, and if your last possession is your shirt, man, don't get off that park bench, because you've been waiting your whole life for this to sink into, this sort of, it seems to me that there's no reason that these things cannot be integrated, essentially. And so that's a huge piece of what we're working on right now. When someone gets out of one of our programs, I've just started, we've had a program for this for a long time. It was an experiment in this that we've been doing for years, called the Explorers Course, because I think that people go from seeking to finding, and from finding to exploring the world from like a much greater sense of freedom and possibility than they had before. They're not compulsively seeking like they used to be, but like there's still a world, right? I mean, and so they're, how they're showing up in that world is this kind of a more free explorer of sorts, right? And what's occurred to me over the years is that exploring metaphor is great, and I think it's very accurate, but it's not necessarily what the average person needs. In the Finder's Course, 4 months long, $2,000 to $3,000 to go through. There were, it was a very limited percentage of people that could take advantage of the Finder's Course. And a lot of the people who could were actually retired, right? And so if you think about it, we had this pool of subjects that were really sort of skewed in the direction of retirees, and they could just go to the park bench, or they could just go to the cave. They were kind of set up for that. They were retirees that could shell out $2,000 to $3,000 for a program, which most retirees can't. Most retirees, like if they have a $200 expense, it's like the end of the world. And so this is a very sort of unique subset of people that were able to take advantage of our initial set of experiments.
Did you see that going in, or is that something you kind of realized afterwards?
Yeah, I realized it coming out of it, really. Realized that when we really started to crunch those numbers and look at, people didn't have kids for the most part. It was very rare for someone to have young children and to have taken the Finder's course. It's not that there was nobody, but if you've got young kids and a job and you're trying to hold your marriage together, and we're saying to you, can you just give us 3 hours of your life every day for 4 months? Right? People are like, hell no, I can't give you 3 hours of my life every day for 4 months. Are you insane? Like, do you have any realization of what my life is like? Right? And so, just skewed to young professionals that didn't have kids, that were working 9-to-5 jobs that paid them reasonably well. And,
in a way that kind of lends credibility and support to what you're all about from the beginning, in that, like, if you had really put on more of your marketing hat from the beginning and said, okay, what's the best price model? What's the best price model to reach this demographic? And how can we provide the least amount of services in order to get the best kind of reoccurring revenue stream? You wouldn't have done it that way. And I think it speaks to the fact that you did it the other way around. You're saying, no, this is a fundamental cultural shift we're talking about. I love the way you put it. I wrote it down. Switching the culture from a ego-centric, narrative-centric mindset to a, what did you call it? Fundamental well-being mindset. I think you really got to let that sink in culturally. And as you said in that story, that was fantastic story. The culture shapers will never let that happen. That just will not happen on a large scale, but that doesn't matter. You could still, to use your term, transition tens of millions of people and do it basically under the radar, and all the rest of them can go on and buy their Ford trucks. But do you know what I mean? It's not, like I said, if you're just trying to build a cult, or if you're just trying to make a money-making machine, the way you did it wasn't really probably the best.
No, that would have been a very stupid way to have gone about that, for sure. There's a thing in, product design and marketing and all of that called product market fit, right? If you would have had to, you could not have possibly gotten further from the concept of product market fit and come up with a protocol like the Finder's course. It's just like, that made it brutal, for all of those years. For sure. But that's one of the great, but one of the things that you do, I was with a friend of mine who's a venture capitalist out here in Silicon Valley named Tim Chang, who's one of the greats, I think, in the venture capital space, just in terms of who he is as a person, who he is as a human being, his own evolution, his own, evolutionary path, what he funds from what is really a major firm that he's at out here, one of the great firms. And, we were talking about some transformative technology stuff, and the conversation turned to Finder's course. And he said, it's really interesting because obviously speaking with him, obviously from my perspective, I can see what you've done is exactly sort of systematically what one would do in a product development sort of way. He's like, you started with, your fundamental and basic research. You made sure that research was sound. Then you put that research to the test to see if it really did, what you thought it would do. Continuing to do research on that to make sure it was sound. And he said, and of course you start off in a situation where it's only people like me that can probably afford it and that can afford to do it. And that's fundamentally sort of an unfair part of our whole consumer world, our whole consumer culture. But that's just the way products start. They often have to start at somebody who has a lot of disposable income and, more disposable time, perhaps, than others in order to be able to get to the next step
Let's talk about that transition that you're going to make, because your telling of the story there is a little bit of sounds like a venture capitalist weaving, reimagining the story. Because no, really,
I love other people's perspectives on this, though, because it really helps me to.
I'd hold to my perspective, which is I think you were doing it for different reasons. I think you were doing it for the reasons because you were really interested in making sure that people could make this fundamental transition, because otherwise, no, I mean, I'm an entrepreneur too. I mean, you would have just gone out and gotten some money and sold the course for $99 from the beginning, because that's the price point. And you would have gotten it out there, and you wouldn't have spent so much time sweating all the metrics and all the rest of that crap. And you would have approached it differently. I think your friend Tim is being kind, but I think he's distorting it from a business standpoint.
There's truth in that, but there's also, I think, in me, all of these different elements. The whole thing really started just because I wanted to get happier, right? And so the initial impetus for this wasn't I want other people to be happy. It was a type A, high achieving personality saying, okay, how do I high achieve with my own well-being? And having taken a crap ton of other courses, basically given up on the belief that anybody else had an answer for them. And so saying, all right, well, I'm going to stop what I'm doing with this other stuff, because if I keep doing it, I'm going to be as happy as I am today. And it's not what I want. That's not the outcome that I want for my life. So how do I take my high performing self and point it in the direction of getting to more happiness, right? And so if you look at the actual genesis of this whole project, it was an incredibly selfish endeavor by, what at the time was sort of a type A, high achieving person to get to their own level of happiness.
I don't see that. I don't see that, but that's another story.
But then you're right. It did become really a moral obligation, I think. From my perspective, I view this as
I think as you sat there at a young age and watched your mom on the Christian Broadcasting Network, you saw both sides of it, and you saw the side of it that you wanted to strip away, which is the fake side, but you saw the other side of it, that people really do need help.
Totally possible. Our psychologists are all full of blind spots.
And you might be one of those people on the other end of that who really does need to make some kind of transition, and helping people make a transition like that is probably one of the highest callings we can have if we can keep our own crap out of it, which it seems like you've really, really tried to do. And so now I think
the benefit of science.
Well, that is one of the benefits of science, which we're at such an interesting point in our history here too, which we will not get off on that thing. But science has been so distorted and misused at this point in our history, and it's really, really difficult to sort through, who's really telling the truth and who's using it as a tool for control and manipulation, no matter where you take that. But let's get back to talking about this class, this course that you have, and potentially where you're taking it. Because again, I explained this in the beginning, when I first met you, one of the things that really intrigued me was your larger vision for transitioning again, to using your term. But what I really like is I like this other term, is creating a culture centered around fundamental well-being. And you had a vision for that expanded way beyond reaching a few thousand people in a course. Right. And so you have both a technology component that you're working on towards that long term, but then in the short term, you're also seeing a way to change your course to reach larger numbers of people who didn't fit those requirements that you had in the first course. So let's talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I was thinking the other day, about a month ago, as we shoot this interview, June 12th, I turned 50. And as I was coming up I started this when I was 35, really. Made the life change, went back to school at 36, had just sort of decided on how I might approach it, by age 36, and was heading down that track, did some preliminary stuff starting at 35. So you're talking about all of the second half of my 30s, all of my 40s, which are, of course, the most productive times from, sort of an individual lifespan. You look at the business research on all that type of stuff. When are people most productive? What's their peak productive years or whatever? Those are the peak productive years, basically. And so I was, as it started to roll into my late 40s, when I hit 45, I was thinking to myself, geez, it doesn't seem like there's an end in sight here. But gosh, it would sure be nice if, we could have something that was available to way more people by the time I'm 50. And it's funny because at the time that 50 hit, I was in Iowa and I was doing research with our direct brain stimulation technology, which is 5-10 years away, still at this point. But nonetheless, showing huge promise, and we're on the bleeding edge of that whole space, and all of that. And I was, not really doing what I should have been doing to hit that 50 mark. And then the virus hit, and I couldn't be in a lab with subjects putting transcranial ultrasound and, other of these various technologies on their head. I had to I went to, I'm from Peoria, Illinois, so there's still houses in Peoria, Illinois. So I went to a house on the river, sort of on Peoria River, Illinois River, Peoria Lake, beautiful view, great place for somebody who's in fundamental well-being to sink into peace, out the, wall of back windows every day and all of that, right? And while I was there, I was like, well, crap, okay, I've got the ultrasound with me. I can experiment on myself or a handful of friends maybe in Peoria, right? But like, what am I going to do during this time? And there was this really important thing about the Finder's Course data. And that is that the Finder's Course experiments transitioned about 70% of people that successfully completed them, that went all the way through the protocol, gave us pre-measures, went all the way through, gave us post-measures. That's what I call an alumni, or somebody who successfully completes that protocol. In that data of that 70%, roughly 60% of those transitioned happened from one type of method. And I'd always in the back of my head wanted to go back and do a smaller experiment around just that. What happens if you just take those methods and you kind of put them on their own in their own thing? But I would have never done it, frankly, if not for the virus hitting, because we're just so heads down on the possibility of the direct brain stimulation stuff. And it's, really where we're at. We're researching the integration piece for people that have already transitioned. That's getting a lot of time. We're doing the direct brain stimulation. That's getting a lot of time. There's no way I would have started a new thing around transitioning. In my mind, like, the Finder's Course was out there, even though not a lot of people could take advantage of it. If you were really serious about transitioning, you could take it, and you could, you had great odds of it working for you. Like, I kind of felt like we'd done enough for the time being on that. And the real future was in this technology stuff. And I just had to spend a lot of time on it, getting it to that point where it could really affect billions of people, right? But COVID hits, and suddenly I'm sitting, in a house on a river in Illinois with nothing to do. And that experiment comes to mind. And I think to myself, I have a studio in the house here, more or less in all of my houses there's a studio because we generate so much content. So I'm like, I've got a studio here. I can shoot new videos of instructions and stuff like that. What the hell? I'm literally, like, practically one day I just woke up and thought, I'm going to send an email out to our lists, and I'm going to see if anybody signs up for this, if anybody is interested in this. And I'm just going to be totally transparent. I said exactly what I just said to you. We're going to basically just experiment with these methods. I have no idea if it will work. I'm sure some people will transition. It could be almost no one. It could be a lot of people. I have no idea. We have no data on this, but if you want to participate in this pilot, you're welcome to come and participate in this pilot. We priced it at $120. because I've always done pilots that way, like $120 is, when I first did the first finder's course, I think it was like $150 or something like that I charged, just to get the people who are serious and who might actually go all the way through the protocol. If you make something free, they drop out in the first week, right? But if you find that bare minimum threshold, you can at least pull people through, enough people through more of the program to get decent statistics and all that on it. And I remember when I was first doing the finder's course protocol, I was thinking to myself, $150 is fair. It's like, it's not much to pay if we're successful. And it's not much to pay if we wind up making people insane. Which, we had no idea, right? If this was going to like totally mess people up, or if they were going to have, great outcomes or no outcome, or, whatever else. And so I didn't want it to, so I follow that same sort of idea with all of our pilots, right? And so I charged $120, and unbelievable to me, hundreds of people signed up. By the end, over 800 people had signed up. We couldn't take 800 people into an experiment. So by the end, we were just being nice and letting people come in and take the class during COVID. But, so what kind of came out of this COVID period that is really interesting to me is a 6-week protocol. And out of that, the transition rate looks like it's 64, 65%. Which is astonishing if you think about it. If you have a situation where you can go through a 4-month program with a 70% chance of success, or you can go through a 6-week program with a 64, 65% chance of success, that to me is revolutionary. Now, for $120, we subsidize the crap out of that, right? I mean, it's not like a sustainable thing that you can just drive ads to and keep in the marketplace or whatever else. And so what I did was I gave the people that went through it the opportunity to participate. I said, listen, if you want this thing to stay alive, we can't afford it. So we're going to have to, we could charge $1,000 for this, and it's a sustainable deal, right? And so one route is we can just charge $1,000 for this. Another route is we can not do it again, and we can just write up the data, and it can be a great experiment. And the third route is you, as the people who went through this, can keep this thing alive as volunteers, and we can, continue to make it broadly accessible to a much wider range of people. And we had over 100 people that went through the program, like 150 people volunteer to keep this thing alive. And they're doing all kinds of things. There's a marketing team, and there's a course implementation team, and there's a course support team that have really sort of come together. And that, for me, as someone who's been under attack for years, in our work, there's no way for me to describe how heartful it is to see, these people coming together to make this a possibility. I mean, it's felt like sort of us against the world for a long time in these experiments, initially against the academic world, and of course over the years, and endless conference presentations and endless interactions with colleagues and stuff, that's finally, not a hostile environment for us anymore at this point. But for a long time it was. The scientists just didn't feel like this was something that could be studied. It sounded too mystical. It sounded too magical. It sounded like it was a bunch of people that were crazy, frankly, that were experiencing psychopathology or whatever. They're like, that's just a waste of time to study. And so it took us years fighting those battles. And then, all of the traditionalists that, believe that Jesus is the only way to experience this, or, that the only valid experience is you're sitting in some exotic meditation position and there's a blue light that starts in the far part of your visual field and moves then. And if you haven't had that experience, then you're not in fundamental well-being or whatever, right? I mean, it's been a battle against those folks, for all of this time. And so it's really been such a blessing to have this, first of all, right before 50. What are the odds, right? I mean, there's got to be some unconscious goal programming intention thing happening there. But right before 50, to have this thing that can affect and can be in a lot more people's lives. And then to have the people that went through it initially be so like totally on board, and they're the cross spectrum. There's the scientists in there. There's the hardcore Buddhists in there. And there's ordinary people in there, and they're all coming together to make this a reality for, I think, what will probably be millions more people that could take advantage of this program.
Let's break
that's
that.
incredible to me.
Yeah, no, that's great. So we're talking about Finder's Course 2.0, if you will, and that was kind of a great summation.
Yeah, it's called 45 Days to Awakening Challenge right now, but yeah.
Oh man, I'm glad you put such a catchy marketing spin on there, or it just wouldn't have been the same.
I didn't think anybody would sign up for it initially. I was like, I wonder if I can get a small group of 6 or 10 people to do this. Well, I was stunned when hundreds of people started to sign up.
One of the things I want to do right there, because I mean, I don't want to kind of push I certainly don't want to push what you're doing. I don't know. I'm just doing what anyone would do, is just kind of looking at the numbers, looking at the detractors. Like I tell people, one of the first things I always do when I have a guest on is I type in Jeffery Martin fraud, Jeffery Martin scam, Jeffery Martin con, so this is what I do, because
it's an interesting habit.
you have to, because
I probably don't want to type any of those things into Google, do I?
Well, let me tell you, you kind of do, because in a lot of ways it's encouraging. I mean, I was able to sort through that relatively quickly, and people just say stuff that well, I have to be anonymous here because, wait a minute, well, why do you have to be anonymous? Who are you? Well, because I signed a non-disclosure agreement. I go, wait a minute, I've talked to Jeffery Martin. I know he shares this stuff. He's not going to sue you because you give him a bad review. That's total bullshit. And then when you even dig in further, what people are saying on the negative front, well, I didn't finish the course. And it's like, okay, well, you didn't finish the course. That's your prerogative. But do you really want to evaluate the course on somebody? So I think the criticisms that I found, and I searched, just pretty quickly fell away with the kind of stuff you can see on any YouTube video where you got haters on there, instantly trying to put the thing down. So that's not my role here. My role is not to, so people know I signed up for your course, and I didn't complete the course. It was way back in the day. And it was mainly just because it was kind of tedious in terms of some of the data that you were trying to collect. But I was really
especially
impressed.
Back in the day. We had 10 hours of measures that we would make people fill out and stuff. It was brutal.
Well, I was impressed with what you were doing, and I got close enough to it to say that I have to accept the numbers that he's putting out there. But what I really wanted to focus on, because I think people have these lingering thoughts in the back of their mind. And one of the thoughts is certainly about the money. So we can talk about, how, a couple $1 million that you would make is not really that much money, or how you're really losing money and all the rest of it. People can't hear that. All they hear is the guy wants $2,500 for the class, and that seems like a lot of money. So I do think it's worthwhile, and I don't want to drill on this point because it sounds like I'm, chilling for the course or something. There are costs associated with doing something like this in the way that you do it, and in particular, kind of supporting these groups as they go through it. So there are some costs baked into that, and I want you to just really briefly explain to people why the volunteer model that you're moving towards will, one, allow you to achieve, hopefully, good results for people, but number two, it will unburden you from some of these costs.
Yeah, for sure. Part of it is that it's a research program, and it's been a research program for so long, and it's got a staff of research people. It's not like one guy running a class, where that can have lower costs associated with it. If you're just somebody that sits there, makes a video, and, advertises it on Facebook or something like that. So we estimate that of the $2,500, which was the traditional price of the Finder's course, it's $3,000 right now. And that's because we've started to include the Explorer's course with it. We just think that too many people didn't follow up with the Explorer's course, and we had kind of ethical problems with that, because we really feel like you need the information about, transitioning, how your life changes, and, sort of best practices and things like that. And so that was something we used to sell separately for $1,200 or so. And so I streamlined that so that it took almost none of our time, provided the same information, tacked $500 on, so that we could still support it, and basically bundled it with the Finder's course. So I think if you are just doing courses, then that's, we estimated that the cost to market at a sustainable level, not a level where you would be making a lot of money or something, but just at a sustainable level, would be about half of that $2,500 in terms of Facebook ad costs or YouTube ad costs, and stuff like that. Now, the times when we've advertised, which we don't do very often, but we have done, usually we do that to increase our demographics. And so we do that to broaden our demographics. And traditionally what we've done is we've been willing to spend up to the entire cost of acquiring someone, in order to, to get more people in at a broader range of demographics. And then we just sort of take money from other places, other registrants that didn't come through advertising, that came through word of mouth or something like that, other research funds that we've got. And so it's kind of it's not a very good answer. I get it's complicated. Our world is just very complicated. We've got researchers that we pay for. We've got the support people that we pay for. The Finder's course has almost always been supported, I'd say always been supported, by people that were associated with the lab. And so, there's only so many people in the world that can really answer some of the difficult questions that come in. Traditionally had a very small number of people, that we allowed into each cohort. I mean, we're not running hundreds of people through each cohort in the Finder's course. I mean, lots of times our cohorts are 20, 25 people, 50 people. We always do scholarships. We try to have, lately we've tried to have about 50% of the seats be scholarships. And so that means that you've got, maybe 20 people that are paying the $3,000. And then you've got another 20 people who are paying, often greatly reduced fees. And we have to do that to keep the data demographically broad.
So I just wanted to mention that. I wanted to get that out front because I know it always comes up for people. And I just want them to understand just run those numbers that you just did there.
Right.
This is not like
people should not do this if they want to make money. If there's somebody out there who's thinking to themselves, that looks like a great business, they should just immediately stop that.
Go for it. Go for it.
Not a good business. As someone who built companies prior to this, right, I can attest this is not a good business. This is not a business you want to be in. This is not something you should be thinking about if you want to have a high living lifestyle with good income. It's just the wrong direction to go.
Okay, so Jeffrey, here's another kind of concern. Let me just throw this out there. So you move to this new model, which allows you to open up the funnel a little.
Yeah.
What about the cult thing? Because I do have to throw that out there, right? So almost everyone, that's too much, but so many of these movements, just spoke with, we were talking about our mutual friend, Rick Archer from Boot at the Gas Pump, who does a fantastic job of surveying so many people who are offering
absolutely
trainings and stuff like that. I don't see anyone who has any kind of scientific basis for supporting their claims about how efficacious they are anywhere close to what you have, but that's neither here nor there. People are allowed to go out there and say, hey, this works for me and it works for my people that come to my training. Why don't you give it a try? And if you're so inclined and you like the cut of their jib, then, go for it kind of thing. I kind of like somebody who has some science behind it that I can kind of point to and say, well, maybe I have more of a chance of getting there. But that's kind of neither here nor there. The real point is, if someone's making this decision, one of the things they do have to be concerned about is the cult thing. And I think it's so funny because, again, in talking to Rick, Rick is, these aren't exactly his words, but Rick is somewhat of a cult survivor in that he went through the TM movement for the longest time. I think anyone who really looks under the hood of the TM movement at the end, it really looked so much like a cult. The guys, locked up alone, doesn't see anybody, is having sexual relations, inappropriate sexual relations when he's telling everyone else to be celibate. He's fooling around with the money. I mean, it's just a lot of very shaky, shady things. And we've seen that repeated over and over and over again in all these spiritual circles. So, one of the questions I asked you in an email, and I'll ask it here, is I see kind of where you've built some firewalls to prevent against it moving in that direction.
It's always offensive to me when I'm doing an interview like this and someone doesn't bow to me at the beginning of it. I don't know if we can go back and put that in, but that would make me so much more comfortable with this interview today. Just to let you know, I don't know if you have that with all of your guests. It could just be me and where I'm coming from after all these years. So you're right. One of my great concerns really was that people would want to put me at the center of this, because to me it's about the data, and it's about sort of what science shows us and what science reveals. It's not about the person that really collects it. I mean, sometimes you have somebody like an Einstein who just kind of becomes a legendary figure, or something like that, and there's kind of a cult of Einstein or whatever else. But at the end, it was his work and the science that stands either independent from him in terms of being able to be validated and whatnot by others, or not, or whatever else. And so, yeah, you're right. I mean, I at the beginning, it wasn't a thought because I was doing it for my own well-being, right? And then as I started to think, once I got there and I really started to realize, okay, this is something that should be available there's all these poor seekers out there that are beating their heads against the wall, and they're constantly communicating with me about how frustrating, their lives are. And I went through this really kind of very frustrating period for me personally, where I was constantly getting emails from seekers because stuff doesn't work for them, right? And they would see some talk that I gave or run across some PowerPoint slides that I put online from some academic talk or something, and they would be like, this guy must have the answers. And this was way before the Finder's course, and so they would contact me, and I would have nothing for them, really. Like, I would just have nothing for them. I would be like, well, here are the classifications of the experience. And, like, they wanted to get there, right? And they were just so frustrated. And so that's, I think, where a lot of my moral sort of impetus comes from around this. And I was interviewing a lot of these spiritual teachers, obviously, for a long time. And I could just see that was not a model that I wanted to replicate. I didn't really want their lives. Like, it just didn't seem like their lives were all that awesome, frankly, in the same sense that, like, it's not my dream to return to the academic world as like a chair professor in some department. Like, that's a crappy life in many ways, right? Like, I'm glad I dipped my toe in that. I'm grateful for the years that I had at places like Hong Kong Polytechnic and Sophia University, and places like that, but geez, like, when I compare that to how awesome it was to run companies before this period of time or something like this, is a massive difference in quality of life, right? And so I looked at their lives and I thought, okay, I don't want your life. I've got to make
sage on the
darn
stage
sure that
kind of
people
thing.
don't put me. Yeah, I'm like, I got to make sure people don't put me at the center of this thing. And I went a little too far with that, actually. And so when I first did the Explorers course, one of the things that I did was I set up a community for it. And I totally, completely kept myself out of that community. And that community just totally developed on its own. So there was like this group of alumni, if you will, of sort of our programs that just completely, developed independently of me. And I did it because of this guru concern, because I knew that any conversation that I was in, I was going to get deference, from those individuals in all likelihood. And that it was going to sort of shape the community that they could have. And so now, years later in the Exemplar program, I've learned that wasn't necessarily ideal. That a lot of the knowledge that we have accumulated over the years, it's incredibly valuable to those individuals. It would have been very helpful if I would have been involved in that and injecting that in, and things like that. And so now I'm trying to walk a careful line in this new community where, I often will let a day of people post, before I even think about posting on a post. Oftentimes I'm not needed to post. There's all kinds of experiences from all kinds of people. It's a pretty big community right off the bat with a lot of experience in fundamental well-being, people that have been in it forever, people that are brand new to it, a lot of diversity. It's been kind of amazing. But, I will look through those threads and I will see what is it that I could really add here. Is there anything on this thread that I could add that's, value? And if there isn't, I don't comment on it. I just like people's posts and stuff. It's a private Facebook group. Or if there is, then I will inject my own thing. I think we have to be hyper aware of this. Just because it's just personally not what I want for my life. I don't think it's a great lifestyle to have people projecting all of their stuff on you. But also, I think it's important to allow peers, to allow more of a peer system and to try to be as much of a peer sort of as you can, understanding that I'm never going to be a peer, right? I mean, there isn't anybody else who's put the last 15 years of their life and, millions of dollars in resources and, whatever else into just doing this. Those people did other things with their lives for the last 15 years, which I hope were more fun. For them.
Right.
I did.
But it cuts both ways, right? I mean, that's the one thing that we all realize is that they cannot be your peer when it comes to the Finder's course, and you can't be their peer when it comes to, their career as a neurosurgeon, right? I mean, you can't, can't, right? So we get that. That's awesome. So I'll tell you what, let's kind of, I want to cover two more things as we wrap up. One, obviously, where this course is going in terms of if people are intrigued, and now this does sound like a shill thing, but if people are intrigued by this, and they should be, what is the future like for them? How would they go about doing this? When is it happening? How is it happening? How do they do it? And then finally, I want to talk about the technology thing, because that always intrigues me, and it kind of cuts both ways in terms of God needs our help in terms of wearing your little helmet there to get realization and meet God. So,
absolutely. So the answer to your first question is because of the volunteer involvement, we're going to do at least one more on July 18th, and so that would actually be like July 13th or something when it starts, because there's a pre-week, and that's going to be really our volunteer test. And I think it's going to go really well. And assuming that, that's a correct assessment on my part, I'm sure we'll probably run, we'll try to keep the thing out there, and we'll try to keep it as accessible as it can be, so that as many people can take advantage of it as possible. One of the things that I've done, and I don't know how the second part turns out yet, but the right now, it's called 45 Days to Awakening. I think there will probably be a 45 days to the elimination of depression, and 45 days to, reducing anxiety, and 45 days to all kinds of different things, and slight tweaks to the program because the academic numbers are amazing. There's a huge drop, for instance, in SESD depression scores that we're seeing for this, just like there was for the Finder's course. And there's, more than half the population is depressed, right?
Drill into that number a little bit, because when you do, it's super impressive. And that is that, as I understand it, this is something we've measured for a long time in a lot of different therapy modality kind of things, or whatever thing they talk about it. We try and help you this way. We try and help you with medication. We try and help you with cognitive therapy. We try and help you all these different things. And we see, man, that number isn't changing very good. And then you come along and you know how to apply the same standards. You can apply them, and that number shifts. That's why it's significant. What can you add to that or correct in that or whatever?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely correct. And so if you think about, so let me actually look at the numbers here real quick, because I've got the spreadsheet open, because I thought, you said you wanted to go through numbers, and I'm a numbers guy, right? So I'm like, cool. So we had, ultimately, in terms of people successfully completing, there were 3 cohorts of the 45 days initial experiment. And I thought there would only be 1, but so many people referred other people from the first cohort that I started a second one like a week later. And then so many people referred even more people that, like, I don't know, a few weeks after that or something, I started a third one that isn't part of the experiment. So it's only the first two that are basically part of the experiment. There's a limit, just in terms of what we can do. And so 332 people from those first two cohorts wound up, basically going through and successfully giving us pre-post data on the SESD measure, which is the Center for Epidemiological Studies depression measure, one of the most widely used depression measures out there. And basically, there was a percent change in that overall population that was not that much compared to what we'd seen before, which was 12%. Now, what's interesting is that just because of the nature of our work, a lot of people that took the 45 days experiment were already experiencing fundamental well-being. And so a huge percentage of those 300 people wound up sort of already experiencing fundamental well-being. And so that causes us to sort of have to go back through and take a look at the numbers at more of an individual level.
Just to get a more accurate baseline, right?
Yeah, that's right. And actually, I actually was looking at a different column. That was a different value. And it was so in the Finders course, it was basically like half, it was like a 50% reduction practically. And in this number. And the fascinating thing about this from a 45 days number is that in that overall, in that sort of 333 people or so, 332 or 333 people, it was actually a 41% drop. And if you think about the fact that probably half of those 300 people were already in fundamental well-being, imagine what the drop is in the individuals that weren't in fundamental well-being. And I don't have those numbers yet, but it's going to be, sort of off the charts. And so one of the things that we looked at then was, well, what happens if you just sorted on everybody that was in some form of fundamental well-being, which was 224 people. And that, even with tons of finders in that, tons of people who experience fundamental well-being in that, it's a 51.72% drop. And the effect size, the Cohen's D, for anybody that knows what that is, the effect size is a 0.7 for that, which is just, it's just crazy. And so, like, what is that number going to be when we take out the people who already had a low depression score?
Well, do this for me, though. Do this for me and do this for the audience. Compare that. You do know the numbers and you know the science. So compare that to something else that people can relate it to, something else they could do that has been clinically measured to effectively deal with depression.
Yeah, that's the thing. I don't know of anything that
some things out
shows
there
that level of drop, right?
But hold on, man. Just hit the high points of, again. So there's a lot of research been done on exercise, on sleep, on diet, on all sorts of different pharmaceutical products that you could do.
Right.
So all that research
for
is
sure. I assumed you didn't want me to mention pharmaceuticals.
No, I'm just saying
that's kind of an obvious one.
But I'm mentioning it from the standpoint of you're making a claim here. You're making a claim that this number is off the charts. I want, if someone wants to go investigate for themselves, they go, oh, okay, here's a guy who did an experiment on
go to Google Scholar and, search on meta-analysis of depression, really.
And they're going to find people that tried to do it the same way that you tried to do it, in terms of have a control and then have an effect and see what the effect size is and measure it. And they're going to wind up in a lot of ways talking in the same way that you're talking about, and their numbers aren't quite as good. So there you have it. That's the sum total of what you're talking about.
And for them, they'll have to, you'd want to search on it. Also, not just from a depressed population, right? Because our population wasn't a bunch of depressed people. We don't know. It was 330 depressed people. It's a much smaller number of people who were depressed. And so if you really wanted to do an apples to apples comparison, what you would do is you would go and you would search on somebody who had sort of done the normalization of a measure, like says D, right? And so, they gave it to
College
either,
students.
they paid Gallup to give them a cross representation of people, right? Or they did it to 1,000 undergraduate students that were taking Psych 101 and wanted to pass the course and were forced to take the thing, or, in order to do that, or, any one of these various ways that you sort of get it kind of a normal population. And if they really wanted sort of apples to apples, and they would have to look for a meditation study that used this, or a positive psychology study that used this to come closer. The problem is that there really isn't an apples to apples direct comparison, because there isn't we're working on writing this data up now. This phase is closing for us. This transition research phase, it's closing for us. And so we're in the process of creating the articles, basically, around all of this data, finally, after all these years. And so what has happened is our staff members have been out there combing the literature for comparison studies and data and information, because that's, of course, what you have to put into the introductory session. You have to then compare it to the discussion section, right?
Let me ask you this,
right now that there isn't apples to apples, a pure sort of apples to apples out there. There aren't these meditation and positive psychology thing. That's very novel. The length is very novel. The intensiveness is very novel. It's a really novel thing.
Let me ask you this, because it's
going to make for a great article. By the way,
well,
it's going to make for an article that gets a lot of citations, which is what you want on the science side of your life.
Man, that's exactly where I was going. It's like you read my mind there, because I want people to understand, part of this is understanding the science process, the scientific method, both as it is right now with all its failures and failings, but also why it's in a lot of ways the best we have right now. And I think that one of the things you touched on, that, because I have this show coming up where there's this guy, and I don't even want to mention his name, but he's out there and he's saying all this stuff, and he's really prominent in our community. And I've looked into his science, and it just doesn't measure up. And I've gone to people that should know, where people that should be citing his work. And I'm like, why aren't you citing this work? And they're saying, because it's garbage, man. I mean, I can't come out and say it in public, or I don't want to. I don't want to get in any big public fight, but it is complete, utter garbage. And it's in the quantum physics realm, where a lot of people are even more afraid to talk, because that's so,
right.
But yeah. I don't want to digress too far. What I want to emphasize is what I understand, what I take from what I've discovered so far about your work is you're in the social sciences. You're connected with people who should know, who are monitoring your work. When you get peer-reviewed work published, it really is peer-reviewed. It really is, people should know better. When you present at conferences, people in the audience are the people that should know, would be able to raise their arm and go, that's right. Totally ridiculous bullshit, Jeffrey. That's not true. That's the level.
And you want them to do it. That's why you show up at the conference, right? Because you're like hoping that the arms will go up so that you can improve for the next round.
And
exactly.
So I just get that that's where you're at, and you have had those arms go up, and you have dealt with that. And that's just a different level on this stuff than somebody who's trying to wrap themselves in a cloak of science, but not really trying to engage in the scientific method and all it means. So when I said I want to drill into the numbers, I want to drill into what's behind the numbers.
For sure. I think that it's funny because the peer review process is so broken. I mean, if anyone searches on this in Google, they'll just see endless amounts of critiques and data analysis critiques, philosophy critiques, just all of it. I mean, I don't know of anyone who thinks wow, this is really awesome in science right now. One of the issues that you have is that journals all have their specific slant, right? And so, for instance, there's a major religion and spirituality journal out there that has as one of its primary editors people who are really into the type of research that we do. But the senior editor makes almost completely certain that none of that work shows up in it. right? And so you can even have a situation where you look at an editorial board of a journal and you think to yourself, oh, wow, you know, in the senior editor ranks, there are people friendly to this work or that work or whatever else. And yet none of it will ever get into that journal, you know, because the person that sits at the top of it will stamp it out. And so it's this massive political infrastructure. It often deals with people's individual careers. Like, you know, why, if I'm at the top of my field after 60 years, why would I want you to come along and upend my career, right? So I'm just going to keep you out of the system of information sharing or whatever else, right? And that's why, to my mind, and I think to most people's minds, frankly, that are in the sciences, the real peer review happens among your colleagues and among the actual relationships that you build up. Like, nobody submits an article that they haven't mailed to all of their friends first and made heavy modifications to based on what all of their other, you know, professor and scientist friends said about that article. Ironically, it's if it is a journal that is going to publish it, they'll often send it back to those people to do peer review. Because there's a small pool of people that are experts in each area, you know, and kind of everybody's peer reviewing everybody else's stuff anyway at an official level. But at an unofficial level, you're sending this out, you're sending a draft paper out to everybody you know who's interested in what the paper is about. And you're taking their feedback back and you're modifying it. You're probably sending it to them again and begging them to read it one more time or whatever else. That's really where peer review happens in science. And I think where peer review, even beyond that, happens is really in person in conferences. You know, it's when you're standing up, first of all, it's where your people who are interested in what you're into get together in person. It's where you build the relationships that allow you to send the emails when you have written something, or when you are thinking about a new experimental design and you want a bunch of other people to comment on it or whatever else. So you build the relationships really by going to in-person conferences and events traditionally. Probably that will resume after COVID, I assume. I guess current, you know, new students or something are at a little bit of a disadvantage at the moment. And so then at the conference, of course, you're presenting whatever your latest findings are. Conference findings are always years ahead of publications for the most part. And so you're presenting your very latest stuff for a room full of people, and you hope that there's a room full of people who are interested in it to jump up and down on it, right? And to catch you in the hall afterward with their concerns and whatever else. And that's really where true peer review happens. There is a very vibrant peer review process in science. And if, you know, I think there's been, rightfully so, a massive critique of the journal system. And, you know, it's whether or not its peer review is even remotely relevant. It probably isn't that relevant, frankly. But that doesn't mean that scientific peer review is, you know, as dead as sort of, you know, those critics would like others to believe. It happens all the time, but it happens at the level of conferences. It happens at the level of individual relationships. You know, even as you, I don't know if you know this or if your, you know, viewers and listeners know this, but generally speaking, when you submit a paper to a journal, you're asked to also submit your recommended reviewers, right? Think about that for a minute, right? Like there's this public perception that the impartial journal editor takes your paper in and evaluates it on a first pass for, you know, whether or not it's meeting a level of scientific rigor, and then sends it out to people who have no idea that it's from you, right? For independent analysis and feedback, and this, right? When in reality, and they choose the reviewers for maximum impartiality. And, you know, in reality, when you submit a paper, you know, the journal editors don't want to try to figure out who the hell might be the right people for, I mean, they're going to send it out to random people, basically, if you don't include reviewers, right? And so they always say, hey, who should I ask to review this? Give me a list of 2, 3, 4, 5, depending on the journal, you know, reviewers that I should send this to. I mean, of course, you check with those people first, right? But probably they're the people who already sent you revisions on the draft in the first place, right? I mean, you're not going to be like, let's see, who might be completely against all of my work? Yes, I'm going to suggest them as a reviewer, right? And so it's the people that are already in your peer circle who have already seen the paper, read the paper, commented on the paper. Even if they haven't, they're going to take one look at the paper and go, oh, this is from Jeffrey, or this is from such and such, because they're, you know, everybody's familiar with everybody else's work, right? So there is no real blinding in this peer review system to begin with, right? And of course, everybody cites their own prior work, right? And you try to stuff a paper with your own citations. And so even if you're a blinded reviewer, you can tell who the paper's from because they've stuffed it with their own citations from previous papers in most cases, right? So it's just, there's a lot of very rightful critique of the journal system. But what I think your viewers and listeners should take heart from is the fact that the actual spirit in science is very much there. And, those of us who are involved in it, we are constantly seeking peer review of others. We're constantly trying to build new relationships with other people who are interested in what we're interested in. We're constantly trying to get people to, help us produce better work. And we're constantly helping other people who are in our space to try their best to produce with however they're going about it, better work. And so the peer review system is really alive and well. It's just sort of invisible to the average person. And then the only parts of it that are visible are like the journal version of peer review, which is getting all of this massive critique right now, and probably rightfully so. And so you see some journals that are trying to change this, right? Like, there's a journal called F1000, for instance. And its peer review process is transparent. Like you could upload a paper today, and then it's sort of like making the process of what's actually happening behind the scenes transparent, right? And so like I would upload a paper there and I would email all my friends and be like, hey, can you go review that paper? And instead of it being something that just occurs in my inbox, it's now occurring posted publicly to the web and everybody can see everybody else's comments. And so that is the absolute bleeding edge sort of a system of peer review. I don't think it's where everything will head. I think it'd be nice if it was where everything would head. But so anyway, that's what I would say about this. Peer review is one of those things where people either falsely just say like, well, where are the journal articles? And that's just some gold standard of evidence or whatever, because they have no clue how that system works. Or they do know how that system works. And they're like, well, that doesn't mean anything. And so people have these biases one way or the other. So I thought, that was kind of a long ramble there, but I thought maybe it would provide some context for people.
It did. I thought it was that's useful. That is very useful and well articulated. Okay, so we've been at this for a long time. Time just flies by when I talk to you. It's awesome. Tell folks about the technology angle and both sides of that. You're always super excited about it. Wow, I'm going to be able to help tens of thousands, millions of people. And I'm always a little skeptical with God needs our help. Go to Gary.
Sure,
go to Gary.
Right.
I always reference, Gary Schwartz and his soul phone at the University of Arizona, which, probably, just to I think it's good. Let me just make sure I throw this on the table so you can have this in the back of your mind. So Gary Schwartz, extremely well-credentialed academically, PhD, Harvard. Rarely does someone get a PhD.
Ivy League professor before he went to Arizona.
Exactly. It's very, very rare that, you graduate from Harvard and they go, wow, you're great. Let's make you head of the department, even down the line, even after you've done other things, because it kind of looks a little too comfy. But and that Yale head of the psychology and psychiatry department, all the right credentials. Of course, he went on Geraldo Rivera's show and got set back a couple of steps in his career because it looked to some people as if he was, in this after-death communication work, which is what he got involved with, that it gets very tricky in terms of the relationships you have with subjects and subjects' families and all the rest of that stuff. I don't think there was ever anything truly inappropriate, but it just didn't sit well with people, and he took a step back. But now Gary's coming back on the scene with the soul phone. No intonation there.
I didn't know that. That's interesting. I have to look that up.
So what you can do is now we have the technology and the cost has come down. You can put a little photon beam, shoot that photon beam, and you can ask disincarnated spirits, hypothesized disincarnated spirits, to interrupt that photon beam when they're asked questions, right? So I'm talking kind of gobbledygook terms, but basically you can now do medium readings, and you can evaluate the response electronically with photon beam, which is super sensitive. they claim to be getting extraordinary results, and that is something that you have to take seriously because they can measure that, right? I mean, they can measure whether that stuff happens.
Yeah.
The point of all that being is that it in a strange way, it's way on the cutting edge of where you may be heading with the technology that you're developing, because ultimately, when we get to the spiritual part of it, it begs the question of, what are we really trying to do? What is our relationship with, I don't know, this higher consciousness, if we accept some kind of hierarchical structure to consciousness? What is our relationship to God? What is our obligation to the moral imperative to do the right thing?
We should ask the photon beam, sounds like.
Well, hey, you say that kiddingly, but they definitely
not really. I'm kind of curious.
Yeah, I know. Well, they're going to ask, and so let's spin
I know
that back.
Gary. He's a serious guy for sure. Very.
But let's spin that back to where you are, because that's really the next level question. I think the first thing would be, tell us what you're doing technology-wise. Tell us why you're doing it, because hell, I mean, do it to make this shift from an ego state-centered culture to a fundamental well-being centered culture. We need that shift. So, get the app as soon as you can and get as many people on it. And then as a secondary point, maybe address how that might fit into a larger spiritual framework.
It's a great question. What we're working with is primarily transcranial ultrasound, which means exactly what it sounds like, transcranial, going through the skull without having to cut a hole in it. And ultrasound, meaning sound, certain frequency of sound wave. It's a very complex pattern of sound. And so it's not just like, it's not like just 500 kilohertz or something shot through the skull. It's modulated in ridiculously sophisticated ways. But that's the basics. Ultrasound is around us all the time. It's probably coming out of your phone right now. It's used by advertisers to track us across apps and stuff on our phones. We're all sort of swimming in a sea of ultrasound environment. Of course, everybody's familiar with it from baby monitoring. You go and get the ultrasound to see if your baby's, got all its arms and legs and all of that kind of stuff. And so this is just a different, very precise ability to use a sound wave, basically a sound pressure wave, to mechanically perturbate a very precise part or parts of the brain. So it's a very simple old technology, updated with really cutting edge modern ability to, precisely target in your brain and stuff like that. And the reason we're doing it is because, one of the things that you talked about earlier was network effects. And one of the first people that looked at network effects of things like non-duality was Zoran Josipovic. He's at NYU, and he basically was doing fMRI work. And one of the things that he noticed was that there seemed to be a rewiring that was going on in the brain of his research subjects. And so he presented, it was important work. He presented that work for years. It was so important. He just presented it all over. He got invited to present it all over. Because that kind of thing just hadn't been seen before at that time. And so we've had a pretty good indication for 10 years about what areas would be ideal to hit in the brain if we could get to them with some sort of technology. But we haven't had the technology that could get to them. And it's only in the last couple of years that technology has matured enough that we can now, basically directly stimulate those regions in the brain. And so that's what we've begun the process of really systematically doing. We've already got a lot of money in it. We've got over $1 million that has been invested in this effort. There are all kinds of other people at other institutions that have, poured tons of money into this technology as well. They're not trying to look at it, to see who can transition to fundamental well-being. They're doing things like getting rid of epilepsy, waking up people from comas, solving addiction problems. There's all sorts of things there are all sorts of places that neuroscientists have wanted to stimulate in the human brain for a long time, based on monkeys and rats and other things that you could do more invasive work on. That just hasn't been possible to translate into humans yet. And we're at a golden age in terms of brain stimulation because of this new technology. We have all of these maps. In our cases, we have these maps of what happens in the human brain for fundamental well-being. Other people have maps for addiction and for depression and treatment-resistant depression and things like that. And so you have an Alzheimer's. There's a guy at UCLA working on Alzheimer's, making great progress on Alzheimer's, for instance. And so you've got this technology, and that's what we're doing with it. And we're getting great effects, frankly. This was really pioneered by a friend of mine, Jay Sanguinetti, who at the time was at the University of New Mexico. Now he's back where he got his PhD at the University of Arizona, with Shinzen Young, a longtime meditator. And so as part of the original project, we put together, the equipment. We brought Jay in. He left his job at New Mexico, came to Silicon Valley for a period of months, and participated and sort of got us kind of up and running, if you will, in the nub of this project. We brought in Sanjay Manchanda, who's another one of the world's leading brain experts in terms of brain stimulation and specifically fundamental well-being. Jay wasn't so much on the fundamental well-being side of the fence, but he had done this work with Shenzhen, and he had these areas that he was targeting, and we had these other areas that from our work that we wanted to target. And so we've just kind of gone from there over the last year or two. And we, all I can say is we're making progress as fast as we can. We're making great progress. If you're in fundamental well-being, we can basically very reliably push you deeper into fundamental well-being. That's what Shenzhen liked about it. If you're not in fundamental well-being, we're having, pretty good success with helping people to reach there. And I think it's probably going to be most widely applied as a meditation aid. It can really, help somebody to just much more deeply meditate right off the bat. So you don't have that trial and error thing with, I tried meditation and that didn't really work for me, and my thoughts didn't slow down or whatever. This is sort of one of those things that you can kind of zap, and the thoughts do stop or slow down. In fact, so much so that ordinary people get kind of freaked out by it because they've never had thoughts going down in their head, right? And they kind of panic. They're like, oh crap, is that going to come back? It's funny.
Jeffrey, it's funny because a light bulb just went off because I remember a conversation that we had a long time ago when we met face to face in Silicon Valley, and it was kind of walking along the parking lot. And you said something always stuck with me. You go, no, they really want me for my data. And the way I connect that with what you're saying now is that if someone had the technology to do brain stimulation in the way that you're talking about, and it had certain effects, what you'd need is to be able to have the kind of neural correlates to map that to. You'd need to be able to say, okay, what does that mean in terms of practically? And in this case, hopefully you are an instrument of good and not an instrument of evil. We can only hope. But you have the data on what this effect, and you have enough of it where you can say, wow, here are several hundred people we could look at, and we could look at those neurocorrelates, and we could come to some. Do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, that's been a great benefit of ours, is that we have the maps in many ways. And so the maps plus the technology. And, it's not that we're like holding them a secret or something. I mean, some of these things, Zorn's published his stuff, there's plenty of the stuff, and there's plenty of the useful map in there. Followed on by that was Judson Brewer, who is, somebody that's in our orbit, who was at Yale at the time, Yale Med. Now he's at the University of Massachusetts. It's kind of like the main guy at John Kabat-Zinn's thing. And he did a lot of important work with both fMRI and EEG and neurofeedback, both with fMRI and EEG, to verify those regions. Because it's one thing to have a map, like Zorn could get a map, but he didn't have the ability to provide real-time feedback. And when Judd was doing this around 2009, I could be remembering that slightly off, but somewhere in that range of years, he had one of the first systems that could do real-time feedback. And so you could say, okay, and now we're going to draw a circle around that area of the brain, and I'm going to show you a chart, a bar that goes up and down, and I want you to make the bar go up, or I want you to make the bar go down. And so he was able to, in non-meditators and meditators and PNSE people and non-PNSE people, see what happens when you try to use it with neurofeedback. And verify really that, okay, yeah, it turns out that part of the brain is related to fundamental well-being. And so, somebody that's in fundamental well-being that messes with it says, well, I have less spaciousness or less whatever. I have more self-referential thoughts or whatever when I make the bar go that way, Judd. That sort of work, right? Really important, groundbreaking work. And so a lot of the stuff is out there. It is published at this point. People can find that. The devices, I think, are relatively inexpensive, frankly. You could build one of these things for probably $1,000 if you really wanted to. Ours cost, our cheapest one is, I think, about $40,000. And it goes into the hundreds of thousands, frankly.
How would those be productized? What do you see?
It's a good question. I think it's one of the FDA is really struggling with this. The regulatory bodies are struggling with this. I think they're not sure what to do with it. And so right now, you can only get this in a research lab. It has to be associated with research in some way. Last I'd heard, I was talking to the guy who had an offer from the FDA to come and run their team. And they had the FDA had a placeholder team in place that was run by a dentist or something. And so, they were just kind of spinning it up, and I was trying to I know this guy well, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for his work. And I was trying to talk him into taking the job, he has a great life. He has a fantastic career. He's an MD at Stanford, where I met him. He was basically sat in one of my classes at Stanford because he was interested in fundamental well-being and transformative technology and stuff. And so he even though he was pretty significant MD at Stanford, he basically came and sat through our class, which is how I met him. And so, it's a hard sell, right? To say, oh, you should leave, paradise, basically, a paradise of a career to go struggle through bureaucracy at the FDA so that this gets done right. But just, last I heard he was thinking about it, it was, he gets the moral impetus. He's kind of locked into a contract he wasn't sure he could get out of. That had another year or two on it. He wasn't sure if the FDA would wait around that long. There were other concerns, but it's more of a regulatory thing, I think, at this point than anything else. And the regulatory bodies in the major countries of the West, at least, of the developed world, have to figure out what they're going to do with this, which means you're going to see this being used like mushrooms in Mexico and, stuff like that, before you're able to have it on the corner store, in Los Altos.
I'm glad I'm 30 miles from the border, man. That's the first thing I thought. I said, Tijuana, man, we're gonna get one going in Tijuana, and yeah, I'm just.
Seriously, we're thinking about this in China. We're thinking about this in Mexico. We have got partners in different places in the world who are willing to put this technology in their centers, and get a much larger number of people through it. The safety data is there at this point. It's not a concern. You wouldn't let some random person throw this on your head. But qualified, as Jay said in his presentation at the TransFed conference a couple of years ago, keep in mind that Jeffrey and Sanjay and I all have PhDs in this. You don't necessarily want to try this at home yet, but there are plenty of PhDs with that skill level to hire. They could go do it in a place like Mexico or in a place like China or in some of these less regulated environments, and they're probably going to get the benefits of this way ahead of. As often happens, with technologies and things, way ahead of when we get it in the West.
So, Jeffrey, one final topic area, and it's a huge one. We could spend another hour talking about that, but I did kind of tee it up a little bit with the Gary Schwartz thing, because you stay in your lane, and I'm glad you stay in your lane in terms of this, fundamental well-being kind of thing, and very much from a traditional perspective regarding consciousness. So you don't get into philosophical debate about whether consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain. You just kind of step around all that. It doesn't directly impact your work. You can kind of be neutral. You can be agnostic on it. The problem with extended consciousness, and I use the term extended consciousness. I think we all know what it means. You're doing work on consciousness, what's going on in your brain, whether it's really in your brain or not. Sure. But then we have all this phenomena that we can't really, we have near-death experience, we have ET encounters, and you can't just blow by ET encounters anymore, because that is a major agenda item politically. It's in the New York Times now, over and over again. It's on all the major, what should we do? And we right off the coast of San Diego, where I live, we have the Tic Tac things, and here they are, and the DoD saying, yes, those really are our videos. We don't know. So whoever they are is pushing that issue to the forefront, where we can't even pretend that that's somehow not on the equation. But, for a long time, we've had Rick Strassman, formerly, I don't know if he's still at New Mexico or not, doing DMT experiments that are clearly going into this extended realm, the shamanic realm that we've always heard about, and the entheogens realm and all that stuff. You've stayed out of that, which I can understand, but the implications for that are kind of huge in terms of what you're doing, because it recasts our understanding of what is the meaning behind what it would mean to be a little less fundamentally discontented, and what that means traditionally as we've understood it in terms of the wisdom traditions, in terms of our communing with some greater sense of purpose. So I guess two questions. The first is just tackling that in general, and then specifically, I'm always intrigued about the technology angle to that, because now you're kind of saying, like, I love the soul phone thing because everyone gets it right from the beginning. It's like, and it raises the same question, what God needs our help. God's up there and he wants to get a message to you, but he can't until Gary gets the soul phone going. And I guess the same thing could be said for your work. It's like, really, God wants you to be awakened, but unless you take this course, he's really not going to let it happen, kind of thing. And I'm not saying you have to address that straight on, but you get that would, if someone thought about it philosophically, that would kind of be in the ballpark here.
Altered states of consciousness is a huge field for sure. And I think from our perspective, and from my perspective, personally, the last 15 years, I would say, have removed a lot of the mystical from this, right? Why is it that we think about fundamental well-being in a mystical or a magical way in the first place? For the most part, it's because of claims that were made about it by religious traditions or spiritual traditions or whatever else, And I think we all owe a tremendous amount of debt, really, to those institutions, which, through the rise and fall of empires, were cultural carriers of the knowledge that you can have this, fundamental contentment, if you will, as a part of your life. But the more I go into it, the less mystical it really seems to me. And I think to some degree that's a problem on the spiritual salesmanship side. I get the position that a lot of those people are in, right? It would have been really, really, really easy for us to fall down a slippery slope over the course of this, right? When I'm trying to compete for your attention with fundamental well-being, and fundamental well-being is something that probably isn't going to lead to, the gates of heaven opening its riches to you, or, you're not going to have a harem that's your dream harem materialize out of the blue if, sort of you're doing it because you think it'll be better for sex or relationships. Or
we're really talking about two different things here. And I think you put your finger on it at the beginning, which is the mystical. But I think we got to get to a kind of fundamental ground level about whether there is such a thing as extended consciousness. I spent so much time in near-death experience science because I think it gets us there. At this point, there is not a serious, credible near-death experience researcher who doesn't maintain that consciousness extends beyond bodily death. They all do. They all came to the same conclusion. Sam Parnia was one of the last holdouts, and he finally has come around and said, gee, no matter how I crunch this data, no matter how uncomfortable it is, and no matter how much crap I'm going to get and probably get ostracized by so many people, that's the data, folks. If consciousness extends beyond bodily death, beyond a functioning brain of any sort that would fit into our current neurological model, then we can't talk in those terms anymore. The mystical is no longer out there. The mystical is the ground of being, if you will, because that is what's being experienced, and scientifically, we can't get past it. So that, I guess, opens the door for considering all these other things that I'm talking about. So I'm not sure where you're going with that.
I think I'm not an expert in any of those areas, so let me preface that. I wind up every few years speaking at conferences where people are speaking about those types of things and meeting the people who are doing the research and sometimes having dinner with them and stuff like that. And so more or less, like, my knowledge of that area is limited to those dinners. And
I gotta poke you a little bit on that, because it can't be. I mean, you're right in the middle of that. I mean, you're kind of forced to have an opinion on that. And what you're really saying is your opinion is that you do not accept that proposition, that consciousness has been demonstrated to extend beyond bodily death. And again, when people say death, where people get hung up, they say, well, that's not really dead. And, the brain might be functioning in some way and stuff like that. And again, I always point people to Sam Parnia, because when I had him on the show, I was kind of mean to him, and I don't even know if he likes me anymore, but he is one of the world's leading authorities in resuscitation. And why he didn't like me is because I really held his feet to the fire and get him to say what he really wants to say, but doesn't feel like he can. And that's that these people, and he does say this, these people are dead. These people are not near death. They are dead by every means we've ever measured people being dead clinically. And their brain is not capable of functioning in any way we would associate with consciousness. So put aside the University of Michigan, brain burst in the rats, and put aside all that, because they've dealt with that. And that's the data. So I can't really let you off the hook in terms of not engaging with that, because it doesn't fit well with your kind of thing about the mystical and, well, it's mystical. No, what I'm saying is the best data suggests that that is the fundamental reality, is that there is this extended consciousness. And when we embody this, kind of brain to consciousness thing, we're in a special subset of it. And if we can put that under the microscope like you're doing, that's fine. But we can't ignore that all this other stuff is happening.
I would just, from my perspective, I just haven't looked enough at the data, right? I mean, I've met a lot of these people in casual situations. I mean, I've been to Russ Targ's house in Palo Alto and, hung out with him and had fascinating conversations about his research at SRI on remote viewing and PK and, stuff like that, right?
I don't know where Russell Targ is coming from, but he's kind of an interesting figure. The remote viewing thing.
Very interesting figure.
Well, I don't know what to make of that. The remote viewing thing is part of it. The remote viewing thing, no bullshit. I mean, just straight up, is part of the MK Ultra program, right? So they want to distance themselves from that a little bit, but it is. They said Sidney Gottlieb was our boss, and we didn't really like Sidney. And when he came around, he wanted to give people LSD and see if they could better remote view. This is their account. I mean, I'm not making this up. This is what they say. But it's part of the MK Ultra program, and Sidney Gottlieb is running the thing. So that doesn't automatically mean that we ignore all the research or anything, but it's different than, Sam Parnia. It's different than Pim van Lommel over in the Netherlands as a cardiac.
Yeah, I mean, Pim's another great example, right? I've run across Pim for years at different conferences and, dinners and stuff like that. I think from the summary that I've seen of his data presented, the longest I've seen is an hour-long presentation from him. I've never dug into the data on or whatever else. But I think one of the interesting, there are big questions that stand out from that. First of all, I think his personal story is fun, right? Where he was like, gets one of the first defibrillators or whatever and is like, brings the guy back to life thinking that he's a medical hero and a god or whatever. And the guy's angry at him. I mean, how priceless of a personal moment story is that to like launch the whole research from, right? So I find him sort of fun from that standpoint. But if I'm remembering, it's been a while since I've seen his presentation. It was something like less than 15% maybe have some sort of experience of near death, something that they bring back and remember, and like some sort of mid to mid-range single figure percentage have a detailed account, have one of sort of the more highly detailed accounts or something like that.
Right,
and
but
so, that I was on a panel with him when he was talking about that, and it made me say, well, okay, Pam, what about the other people? Like, are we
what
are
they
you
think
telling
about
me that we're in a video game and the others are like non-player characters, and when they die,
well,
they just...
I'm going to give you some of the nuances because I'm still holding your feet to the fire here, because this is fundamental to, I think, what you're talking about and what you're doing. It's one way or another. You either fall on one side of it or the other, and it seems to be, again, an important kind of distinction. So one of the things we don't know about who is having a near-death experience is it does seem to be very linked to memory, right? So do you remember your dreams at night, or do you not remember your dreams at night? And there's a lot of people that come and go, I don't dream, and then they go into the dream lab and they go, everybody dreams, pal. He goes, no, I don't dream. I go, okay, go to sleep. And then they wait and they get him in REM movement. They wake him up and he goes, oh my gosh, I dream, Well, there's a lot of speculation that may be somehow in some way what's happening with near-death experience. It may be more tied to remembering whether or not you had such an experience.
I mean, that's the obvious place that you would go if you're thinking about it for 10 minutes.
But really the gold standard, I think, in terms of research that's been done on that, and it's really a very simple experiment, and those are the best always, is just going to people who, what they did is they went to people who were in a cardiac arrest ward, and they said, okay, we're going to survey you, after you have a cardiac arrest, if you do. And they do, and they go to the people and they say, what was your near-death experience like? Which again, in a strange way, ties to this memory thing, because the vast majority of them say, I didn't have a near-death experience. And they go, okay, well, tell us about your resuscitation. And they go, dummy, I just told you I didn't have a near-death experience. I have no recollection of what my resuscitation is. They go, just tell us what you know. So they make something up. They go, well, they probably did this and they probably did that, and they probably had that machine to come and zap me and this and that. And then they went to the people, I think it was 15% in the study. There's several different studies. You can go and look on this, in the 20% range. And they said, what happened during your resuscitation? I go, oh, I'll tell you exactly what happened. Yeah, they did wheel the machine in, but it didn't work. So they said it hard to start doing it manually. And this one woman, she had on a green gown, and she came in and she pushed the other guys out of the way and she jumped on my chest. They told it exactly right? And of course, you're a social scientist. You can't just throw out these accounts. You can systematically organize them and see which are more accurate and this and that. Overwhelmingly, statistically, the people that claim that they had a near-death experience are able to accurately recount facts about their resuscitation process, and others aren't. And, I always add this, you probably know this, I'm almost sure that you do, but in a modern medical hospital, resuscitation isn't happening like you see it in the movies, 5 seconds after they go, beep. No, it's like 1, 2, 3 minutes at a time when we know the brain is no longer, from all our neuroscience, the brain is no longer functioning in a way that we would associate with forming these kind of conscious memories that we know of. And we have a lot of animal and human work to support that. So there's a lot of science here that leads these guys to say, yeah, you got to lighten up on the mystical thing. It just seems to be a natural part of the process that consciousness is extending beyond bodily death. And we could go 10 different places to prove this. I won't bother, but I will come back and say it seems to me fundamental to, in one way it's not critical to your work, but in another way you kind of reach a barrier in what you're doing if you don't take a side on this one way or another.
Maybe the day will come when I have to really immerse myself. I mean, at least I know most of the people that are doing it already. So I have a head start. And I have some frame of reference for it from having known these people for years now. But I think one thing that's important to do one thing that researchers often do that they shouldn't is form opinions and speak about conclusions or even offer opinions kind of out of turn, in the sense that, I don't know that much about Pim, like I said, a few dinners over the years and speaking at the same things. And there was one time when he was like right before me or something. So I saw his whole hour-long talk. It just happened to be one of those where we were both giving the hour-long talks. And, that's kind of the limit. I mean, I like Peter Fenwick, for instance. I consider Peter Fenwick a great friend. He's really into our work. I know him personally very well. I know him to be an incredibly brilliant scientist, very rigorous scientist. He's into, things that happen around death and consciousness and stuff like that. He's always trying to sort of think about our work in relation to his work, and have conversations with me about it here. And when I stay at his house in London, like that's how well I know him. I'm not Peter Fenwick. Like, I don't know what he knows. I haven't spent years developing his expertise, and I haven't looked at his data around his expertise in any degree of depth at all. It's like we talk about it for a few hours before I go to bed. I get up the next day, I go speak at something, I come back at dinner time, and the process repeats. Sometimes he drives me, we talk about it in the car. Sometimes we have lunch because he drove me and he stayed at the event, and we talk, and he's speaking too, and we talk about it at lunch, right? And so what I think we have to be careful to do as scientists, and I would ask people to be as careful with our work as I try to be with other people's work, right? Is unless you have really deeply immersed yourself in these bodies of work, you have to first of all respect the people that have. Like, I have tremendous respect for Peter's viewpoint. I have tremendous respect for Pim's viewpoint. I have tremendous respect for Dean Radin's viewpoints. There's another guy that I occasionally run across, occasionally spend some time talking to. Another sort of big wheel in that sort of extended consciousness area. The people at UVA that are into reincarnation and stuff like that. Same deal with them. Occasionally run across Jim Tucker, I think is his name, right?
Jim Tucker. Right.
Occasionally run across Jim, and we're speaking at something, and maybe we'll have a dinner or something. And so, I have tremendous respect for their work, and I have no reason to think that their work is faulty or in error in any way. I assume that they have a community of peers that they're interfacing with, that they're going through. They seem, to me, to be rigorous scientists who seem to be applying the scientific methods in their areas as best they can. And they seem like intelligent people, many of them seemed like they were unbiased before they got into it, or maybe even thought that they were in it to disprove it, and then got sort of turned in another direction from the data. And so I think as a scientist who sort of glances into their area, it's more incumbent upon me to say, these are people to be respected and listened to.
Let me back up and say, look, I do respect where you're coming from. And I think you've given a very reasoned response. I'm going to pick it apart, but I still think it's a very reasoned response. And that is that, number one, what I hear you saying is that you got to stay in your lane. And we need you in your lane. You know what I mean? Because
I only know my lane to the level that I know my lane,
Exactly. Well, and I think that this interview, if it's effective, is somewhat a testament to the fact that you know your lane and that we can trust some of the conclusions you're coming to. And the process that you go through that you described is kind of saying, this is what it takes to know my lane. So I don't ask me to know at some depth these other lanes. At the same time, I guess what I'm challenging is that, and I don't mean this in a way to kind of jump on or directly contradict what I just said, because I think it's important, and you can only do so much and you can only focus on it so much. But there is a fundamental assumption here, and the default assumption, I think, is really, really pretty thin. And that is the consciousness is an epiphenomenon of the brain. Like I like to say it, we're biological robots in a meaningless universe. And those are kind of stark, silly terms, but that is fundamentally, Neil deGrasse Tyson says that directly. You know, he's one of the most, if he's not an expert on consciousness, which he's not, he's certainly one of the most public science figures in the world. Sam Harris dances around, but he winds up kind of saying the same thing in kind of a mixed, we don't really know where Sam's at any point kind of way, but that's where he comes down. That default position is contradicted by all our best quantum physics experiments. I mean, we've been running that damn double slit experiment every which way for the last 100 years, and it always comes out the same way with the observer effect, which is highly suggestive that consciousness is somehow fundamental, which only fits in one model. It only fits in the idealism model, in the near-death experience model, in the outside of time and space model. It don't fit in the materialist, you're a biological robot in a meaningless universe, and your consciousness is generated by your brain. It don't fit in that model, no matter how many times they want to try and force it back in. So I guess the one critique I'd have, and I'm making it for the 5th time, and then I'll let it go, is that I don't know why you would give deference to the one over the other than that's just kind of what it was when you were coming up, and that's what, you know, a lot of people kind of is their default position.
I don't know if I do give deference to one or the other. I think my answer is I have no idea. And, you know, I haven't looked at that data. One of the things that I did when I was at Sophia University here in Palo Alto, where I was, you know, a professor for a period of years, and even their vice president and dean of research for a while and all that, is I tried to help with the starting of a consciousness studies master's degree that looked into some of this. And what happened was I'd asked someone who's very maligned oftentimes publicly or whatever, but who I personally like, Deepak Chopra, to come and speak at the commencement. You know, the president said, hey, you know Deepak Chopra, can you get him to come and speak at the commencement? And so I thought, well, it doesn't hurt to send an email, right? And it turns out that he'd always kind of been a fan of Sophia, and he, you know, canceled a ton of stuff to come and give the commencement talk at Sophia. And he kind of came with an agenda. And his agenda was that he wanted to start 2 master's programs, online master's programs, so that they could reach anyone anywhere in the world. He was already doing one at UCSD, but they weren't willing to put it online. One that was in like his holistic health area. I can't remember what he called it. He didn't call it holistic health. There was a better term for it than that. And then one in consciousness studies. And the case that he made for the consciousness studies one over dinner, another dinner, right, was that really there wasn't a program that approached consciousness studies that was a serious program from this perspective, from the perspective that you're talking about, from the perspective that you're advocating, anywhere in any sort of accredited, you know, university. There were programs like this in unaccredited universities, state-approved, you know, universities and stuff like that, but not in regionally accredited universities. And so he said, you know, and so I said, you know, listen, I went back, looked at it. He was right. I couldn't find any. And so I started thinking, why not? You know, it certainly seems like there should be a program from that perspective that brings together. So I started emailing everybody. I mean, I emailed, you know, Dean and Stan Krippner and just like anybody that you would have ever thought, Pim, you know, Peter. We can go down the list of the people we've talked about today and 100 others that I knew are in that space. And I said, hey, would you be willing to contribute, you know, to a program on this? And here's the format that I'm thinking, and here's the structure. And we already have one that we can shoehorn it in that's approved by our regional accreditors. It'd be a transpersonal psychology degree with this type of consciousness studies specialization. And so I don't have like an anti-view of this or or sort of a hostile view of this or something. I was actually working to create the first actual scholarly program in it that I'm aware of at the time when I left Sophia University. And then it fell through, you know, after that. Sophia changed owners. Basically, it got bought by a Chinese group. They were a lot more interested in computer science and psychology, and that was that. And so, you know, I do think that this is a very legitimate area of inquiry, one where I know a lot of people who are into it, but just not an area that is, you know, my expertise per se anymore.
One final thought on that, and then I'll let it go, because I totally respect your answer, and is extremely open and direct, and you got the goods. You're there. If you were to kind of speculate for a second, Jeffrey, potentially what could be the implications, since you know what we're talking about here, what could potentially be the implications for what you're doing? Can you even just kind of imagine it? Consciousness survives death. There are these extended consciousness realms.
You mean, what could be the implications for, if extended consciousness was true, what could be a possible implication for it from a fundamental well-being standpoint?
Exactly. And then part B of that is from a technology assisted contact with extended consciousness realms. Because I'm assuming that that's what you're doing, whether you talk about it in those terms or not, that you are helping people reach extended consciousness realms in a different way than they're used to. That you're altering the signal pattern, the frequency, adjusting the radio knob. Like that would be, you're at least familiar enough to understand that could be potentially what's going on. So any speculation on that?
That's a good question. I think Dean Radin, I ran across him at the Science and Non-Duality conference years ago, and he was taking people up to his hotel room and doing EEG on them, basically the people who were claiming to be in fundamental well-being at that conference. So the speakers and stuff like that. He was trying to talk them into going up to his hotel room, getting some EEG, and he was doing one of his presentiment experiments, which is like, I can't remember which one it was. It was probably the one where he shows you the bunch of pictures, and he's measuring you with EEG. And some of the pictures are horrific, you're in a car crash and your torso severed in half or whatever. Probably not that extreme, but pretty close to that extreme. And there are these standardized picture databases that have basically been rated by affect, the amount of emotion they elicit and stuff like that. And what he was measuring was people's physiological responses to those images before they were shown.
Before they were even selected by the computer.
I accept that. That's probably true. And I remember I forgot about that, lost track of it, whatever. I saw him years later, and it just made me think about that experiment. I hadn't seen him in years. Last time I saw him, we were sitting next to each other in the main ballroom of the Science and Non-Duality conference, talking about what he was doing with his hotel room, right? And so that just naturally, that memory just popped back up to mind when I saw him again. And I was like, hey, how did that ever turn out? Did it turn out that they were, and he basically said that, that he thought his evidence showed that people that were in fundamental well-being were basically more likely to have this presentiment effect, as he called it. I think I'm getting that word right.
Yes.
It's been a long time.
That's my understanding.
And so the effect being that they had a stronger reaction to photographs that, if you're right, haven't even been selected by the computer, but certainly hadn't been shown to the subject yet. And that's the kind of thing you can only do with something like EEG, because it has a very tight time course in milliseconds. They're looking at the time courses in milliseconds just prior to the thing being revealed and all of that. And so it really takes a very tricky setup, a very precise system, all of that. It's not easy work to do. And so, but Dean is hardcore electrical engineer, psychological experimenting guy with decades of experience. If he says his experimental apparatus is set up properly, I'm not going to say, geez, Dean, you must not have set your gear up right. I'm going to assume that, he did his job as he, to the best of his ability, which I'm sure is more than good enough. I mean, basically what he's saying in that is it made people more psychic in some sense, right? And so if he's saying, there's people in fundamental well-being have an increased intuition in this way, I think that's an interesting potential answer to your question, because certainly people who are in fundamental well-being at a certain degree and depth do feel like they have a greater intuition or a greater intuitive capability. Now, to me, that's just a subjective, untested report, right? And so as a social scientist, I note it down. I note how many people say it versus the ones that don't feel that way, things like that, right? But then, that's something that so I have a subjective report on one hand, and I have something from Dean. Granted, I didn't really look at the data or the actual findings or the statistical significance or any of that. It was just like, casual conversation in a hallway or something. But I don't think he's talking about stuff that isn't statistically significant, knowing him. And so, I think he was giving me the relevant aspects, the relevant answer from a scientific perspective. Not to pick on Dean, although in good ways in this case, but I remember another time when I first visited him at Ions, he was in like these trailers. I don't know what the story is now. I haven't been there in a long time. And I was just there to, get to know him better, right? But it just so happened that I showed up not long after he got his double slit experiment thing. And so he had this apparatus. He got some donor to give him 50 grand or something. And he bought some double slit experiment thing. And so he had it set up and he had it programmed. And there was actually a lady in there who was running trials. And she, I didn't think too much about it. And so Dean and I were talking about he was doing like chocolate intention experiments or something at that time. And he like gave me this piece of chocolate that was infused with the intention of love or something. And, he gives me the chocolate and asks me if I feel any different and, stuff like that. And I love chocolate. So I was just grateful for the chocolate. I was hungry by that point. Ions took a while to get to. It was longer than I thought it would take to drive out there. Yeah. So I was looking at the chocolate on his desk, and so he was generous to give me some, right? I didn't realize it was special experimental chocolate at the time. I was just like, oh God, I would really love one of those chocolates, right? And so basically this lady goes to leave, his experimental subject goes to leave. And Dina told me all about the experiment and the experimental setup and why he was doing it. And it all sounded kind of interesting. And I was like, well, before she leaves, let's look at her data, And so we go into the other room and it's got like these bar graphs sort of on the screen. And he starts walking her through it turns out each one of the bar graphs is like a trial or something. He starts walking her through the trial and he's like, what did you do on this one? Do you remember what you did on this one? Do you remember what you did on this one? And did you remember what you did on this one? So on and so forth. And all of them were like, I don't know, kind of middle of the road bars. And then there was this one bar that was like kind of off the charts, right? And she basically, he gets to that one and he's like, do you remember what you did at this one? And she just sort of looked at him. And then she sort of looked over at me and the other person from our lab that was visiting with me. And you could tell that she didn't want to say, And so she tried to give like some sort of half-ass sort of response to it. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to, settle for that. Like, you were really precise on the other ones. Like, what did you do on this one? And so she thinks that she pauses for a while and she looks at us some more and she thinks about it and she says, well, there's this thing I can do where I can kind of make myself go away. She describes like basically being able to put herself into this temporary non-symbolic experience. And she's like, that's what I was doing when I did that bar. I thought, well, that's very interesting. I had dinner with Bob and Brenda Dunn of Pear Lab after one of these conferences that we were all at one time, back when Bob was still alive. And it was not long after Bob had retired. And I didn't know anything. I didn't know much about him, And so they were telling me about what they were doing. So I'm like, well, geez, you're at the end of like 25 years of this research, So I'm going to ask you the obvious question. What do you think of what you came up with, And Bob basically gave me the spiel about how he kind of felt like they'd failed. Like how he hadn't even really convinced himself that there was an effect in the data, that he had to use all this, stochastic resonance numbering and all that. And he's like, it seems to me like I could just as easily be pulling out a ghost in the machine that doesn't mean anything as pulling out a real signal from this data. And I thought, yeah, it left me with a lot of respect for the guy. I mean, who spends 25 years of their life and, admits to that at the end of it, right? Especially somebody that's so brilliant as he clearly was. And that's how he chose to just throw the last 25 years of his career into, right? And in some sense, from that answer, kind of away a little bit, you know. You would think, considering all the other stuff he could have been inventing or doing or whatever with a brilliant physics mind like his. And so he gets up and he goes to the bathroom, and Brenda and I are sitting there, and I say, you know, what else should I know about this, Brenda, that I don't know? And she basically goes on to say that, and I don't want to be too, I want to be careful here and respectful of the sort of what might have been meant to be more confidential or whatever. So I'll really abstract it. But the long and the short of it was that she basically felt the same way as that lady in Petaluma. And so this was around 2000, somewhere 2004, 2005, 2006. I don't remember, probably around 2006. And Brenda basically said, you know, it seems to me, she said, Bob wouldn't allow us to collect any psychological data. She was a psychologist. She's like, Bob is a straight numbers physicist. He won't allow us to collect any subjective information from subjects and really work with it in a meaningful way. You know, so she's like, I've only got my anecdotal impressions from having been the lab manager for 20 years at this thing. But she's like, my anecdotal impressions are that there's a small number of people that are producing an outsized effect on this data. And that the thing that they all seem to have in common is that they all basically report, you know, the ability to have sort of this mystical type or this non-symbolic type of experience. She called it, she had a way that she phrased it where she said they would describe a merger or a union with the apparatus to her, you know, a dissolution of their self boundaries and a merger or a union of the apparatus. And so, you know, it's, I mean, you know, as a researcher, these sorts of anecdotal edge things, you know, I don't think that you have to take them into account, for sure. You know, I don't know if 10 years after that or whatever, Deepak Chopra pitching me that program, if I hadn't, you know, talked to Brenda at that lunch and had an occasion to visit Dean at the moment where he just got his double slit thing and heard that lady's account, I don't know what I would have said to him about that program, right? But, you know, you accumulate these little data points and they're not real per se, you know, they're not sort of rigorously sussed out with any sort of methodological rigor. But, you know, they're interesting, curious anecdotes. And they suggest that you shouldn't exclude possibilities that you might otherwise, you know, exclude if you hadn't heard them or just not have ever thought of as possibilities if you hadn't heard them. And so, you know, I mean, it's for me, it's a collection of a lot of this anecdotal type of stuff, off the cuff conversations with people that had done more serious science. But I can't feel as a scientist like I have looked rigorously at the data enough to really feel like I should be having some sort of opinion that other people should listen to, you know, in the same sense that, like, I don't know, if Pim goes out and starts talking about non-symbolic experience after, you know, 6 conversations over 15 years or something, I mean, like, why should he do that? He doesn't know anything about it by comparison, right? I mean, I kind of have that same thing with his work. You know, it goes in there somewhere, right? But to really answer your question, I think, you know, I would have to, I mean, these are my impressions. You asked me, the last question was the impression, but to answer your former question, I would have to, I think, you know, any responsible person that has the skills to look at the data would have to really invest time, you know, to really dig into the data, to dig into the backstories behind the data, because there's a file drawer data is always a lot more interesting than the data that's published. You know, like the stuff with Brenda, that stuff's never going to be published anywhere probably, right? And so it's those file drawer things that add the color that really help you to get the story of the data that lots of times you can't get from just looking at it publicly. You'd have to invest a crap ton of time for me to, you know, really have a legit opinion on it.
Well, Jeffrey, I'll tell you what, we've been at it for almost 3 hours. You're fantastic. I appreciate it. I think this is an interview that will reverberate with me and future interviews for quite some time to come. I just think you're really, really an important figure in this larger issue of our question of consciousness and all that. So I really appreciate you taking so much time and talking today. Tell folks how they would keep track of what's going on, and if they want to give the Finders course a run, And they should pick up the book because the book is outstanding as well and just very, very highly regarded. But tell people how they find all this stuff, finders.
Thanks. These, of course, might change. You never know. But the lab, the center's research has been at nonsymbolic.org forever. And so you can always sort of catch up with that as a central hub. Finderscourse.com. There's 45days.one, 45days.one are the two experiments that are currently running. Who knows what will be true by the time someone watches this video. There's the book, of course, The Finders, as you mentioned, which is more or less available everywhere. That's about it. You know, Dr. Jeffery Martin is my personal website that there's no reason to visit.
Oh, no, there's a lot of great stuff there. Do visit that and you'll see a good summary of all the books and all the other stuff. Well, Jeffrey, it's been great having you on, and so fun. We just jump right
It
into
is.
it.
I love, people love our interviews. Like I said at the beginning of this, it's like one of the three, I do zillions of interviews, and like there's only three that seem to ever be mentioned. And you're one of those three. That's amazing. So
We'll see how
you
this
have
one.
this spin, your personality. I don't know what it is, but it's not me, right? Because I'm in all of them. So they'd be mentioning all of them if it were me. It's got to be something related to you and how you do this, which is great. I'm so grateful for it because
the interaction
it gets people interested and they're willing to watch stuff about this, then that's extraordinarily helpful.
Cool.
So thanks for that. Thanks for what you're doing,
No, okay. Well, mutually. Take care. Thanks again to Jeffery Martin for joining me today on Skeptiko. The one question I would tee up from this interview has to do with this idea about the cultural shift from an egocentric culture to a fundamental well-being culture. What do you think about the prospects for that kind of change? Boy, that gets really deep really quick. So let me know your thoughts. Hop on over to the Skeptiko forum if you'd like to connect with and exchange ideas with other people who listen to this show, including me. That's available to you. You can also go over to the Skeptiko website where you can download all these previous episodes of Skeptiko for free. That's going to do it for this episode. I do have some pretty good ones, I think, coming up. Stay with me for all of that. Until next time, take care and bye for now.